9 months pregnant, alone on a rooftop in the midst of a devastating storm, and the only man who comes to her rescue is America's most powerful mafia boss. Her husband has robbed her of all her money and fled with his mistress. Floodwaters are engulfing everything. Her unborn child is about to be born. And when a helicopter with no government markings descends through the dark rain, she sees the eyes of a man the world fears. He whispers, "You're safe." But is that really true? Like, comment with the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. And follow to the end, because you won't guess the ending. The wind came first. It always did, down here on the Carolina coast. That low pressurized moan that rolled in off the Atlantic like the earth itself was clearing its throat before screaming. Evelyn Hart had grown up hearing that sound from her childhood bedroom in Beaufort, had spent 11 years as a maternity nurse in Savannah learning to tune it out. Hurricanes were facts of life, the same as humidity and red clay and the slow, creeping rot that worked its way into every wooden structure below the Mason-Dixon if you let it breathe long enough. You boarded your windows, you filled your bathtub, you drove inland. You didn't stay. Evelyn was staying. She stood in the kitchen of the house on Magnolia Creek Drive, their house, Travis's name first on the mortgage, with both hands pressed flat against the counter and her lower back burning the way it had been burning for 3 days straight. A deep, grinding ache that started just above her tailbone and radiated outward like something inside her was slowly expanding beyond what her body was designed to hold, which, at 39 weeks and 4 days, was more or less exactly what was happening. The news anchor on the muted television was pointing at a red spiral the size of a dinner plate crawling up the coastline. Hurricane Iris. Category 4, maybe 5, by landfall. Mandatory evacuation orders for 6 coastal counties, effective 6 hours ago. She hadn't left because she'd been waiting for Travis. She understood that now. Understood it the way you understand something that was always true, but that you spent a long time constructing elaborate reasons not to see. She'd called him 14 times, texted him 8 more. The last message she'd sent was 3 hours ago. The water's coming up the street. I need you to come home right now. The little check marks below the text had never turned blue. She pulled up their joint savings account on her phone. Then she stood there looking at the number on the screen for a long time. 0.00. The account had held $47,000 that morning. Money they'd saved across 3 years of double shifts and careful grocery lists and skipping every vacation Travis had wanted to take that she'd quietly vetoed because she could see the math in her head at all times, the way certain kinds of people always can. The ones who grew up watching their parents count change before the grocery store rather than after. 0.00. She set the phone face down on the counter. Outside, a stop sign across the street bowed sideways at an angle that didn't seem physically possible, then tore free from its post and cartwheeled out of sight into the brown water that was already ankle-deep in their front yard and rising. She thought, he isn't coming. She thought, he was never coming. The first contraction arrived 14 minutes later, not the false kind she'd been having for 2 weeks, the Braxton Hicks that squeezed and released without commitment, but a real one, a pulling down sensation that started in her lower spine and wrapped around her abdomen like a fist closing slowly and with absolute intention. She breathed through it the way she'd coached hundreds of patients to breathe, the way she could recite in her sleep. In through the nose, slow, let the diaphragm drop, out through the mouth, controlled, don't tighten what you can't afford to tighten. The contraction held for 45 seconds, then released. She looked at the water outside. 8 inches now, maybe 10. She grabbed her go-bag from the hall closet. She'd packed it 6 weeks ago, because that was the kind of woman she was. Organized and prepared, and now she thought, it wasn't enough, none of it was enough. And she slung it over one shoulder and walked to the back door and opened it and stood there looking at what had been their backyard. The yard was gone. In its place was moving water, brown-gray and churning, carrying a lawn chair and a child's bicycle and a section of white vinyl fence. The rain hit her face like gravel thrown from a truck. The wind was so loud it had stopped sounding like wind and started sounding like the absence of everything else. She waded in anyway. She made it 2 blocks before the current took her. She'd been moving along the edge of what had been Dunmore Street, keeping one hand on the brick face of the buildings, feeling her way through water that had climbed to her waist. The go bag was soaked through. Her phone was in a Ziploc inside the bag, but she didn't know for how long. The contractions were coming every 9 minutes, and she was counting them the way she counted everything, compulsively, the way you count something when you can't control anything else. The current that took her came from the cross street, from the direction of the drainage canal that ran behind the old elementary school. Later, she would piece together that a section of the canal wall must have failed. A surge of water 6 feet deep and moving fast, carrying debris, carrying the accumulated force of a storm that had been consuming ocean for 3 days before it got to her. Later, she would understand all of it. In the moment, it just hit her. The bag went first. Then her footing. She went under and the world went dark and loud, a roaring that filled her ears and her skull, and she had one clear, lucid thought before survival instinct took over and reduced her to pure movement. Not now, not here, please, not now. She kicked. Her right hand found something solid, metal, the edge of a drain pipe bolted to a wall, and she gripped it and pulled herself hand over hand, her belly a shifting, precarious weight below her, until her face broke the surface and she could breathe again. She held onto that drain pipe for 3 minutes, maybe 5, long enough to look around and understand where she was. At the intersection of Dunmore and Calhoun, the squat brown brick building on her left, the old Grierson hardware supply, been closed and shuttered for 4 years. Single story. Flat roof with a low parapet wall around it. She reached it by pulling along the building's facade, and she got up onto the roof by going through a second-floor window that no longer existed. The glass had blown out, the frame was buckled, and she climbed through on her hands and knees and then found the interior staircase and went up. The roof was wet and covered in grit and pieces of shattered skylight. The parapet wall was maybe 18 inches high. Evelyn sat down against it with her back to the wind and her knees drawn up as far as they would go, which was not very far, and she pulled the soaked go bag into her lap and pressed both hands against her abdomen and felt the baby shift beneath her palms. Alive, moving, responding to the cold and the noise the way babies do, turning inward, pressing back. I know, she thought, and she didn't know exactly what she was saying it to. She found her phone in the Ziploc. The screen lit up, 1 bar of signal, flickering. She dialed 911 and got a fast, busy signal. She dialed it again and got the same thing. She tried the non-emergency line for the county fire department, which she had in her contacts because she'd had occasion to call it twice in her career as a nurse, and she kept every number that had ever mattered. Busy. She texted her supervisor at the hospital. Stranded, Dunmore and Calhoun, need help, 39 weeks, and watched it sit in the outbox, unsent, the signal bar gone now, replaced by the small capital letters, no service. The 9th contraction came 6 minutes after the 8th. She breathed through it and counted seconds, and looked at the sky. The clouds were the color of a bruise, rotating slowly overhead, the kind of sky that has intent behind it, that has direction and velocity. Rain hit her face so hard it felt like a punishment. She pulled her jacket tighter across her belly and thought about her mother. Lillian Hart had died 4 years ago, a stroke at 63, the kind of ending that comes without warning and without the decency of enough time to say the things you should have said years earlier. Evelyn had been at her bedside at the end, had held her hand through the last hours, and her mother had looked at her once, really looked at her, with those pale green eyes that Evelyn had inherited and never known what to do with, and said, very quietly, "The good ones always find each other, Evie. Don't you give up before they get there." Evelyn had spent 4 years not entirely sure what that meant. She was sitting on a flooded rooftop in a Category 5 hurricane at 39 weeks pregnant with the savings account at 0 and no signal on her phone when she heard the sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the storm. The Coast Guard bird came in low and fast, its searchlight sweeping the intersection below in long arcs. Evelyn got to her feet, both hands on the parapet wall, the effort costing her more than she wanted to admit, and she waved both arms above her head the way you're supposed to, the universal flag of, I am here, do not leave me here. The searchlight found her, held on her. She saw the rescue swimmer in the open door, saw the orange suit, saw the man raise his arm in acknowledgement. Then the helicopter banked away. It came back around once, flying lower, and she could see the pilot through the windscreen and the look on his face. Not cold, not indifferent, but helpless in a way she recognized because she had worn that expression herself, standing at bedsides where the outcome was already determined. The Coast Guard bird climbed and turned south, its rotors fading into the storm. She found out later that they'd been running on fumes. The fuel situation across the rescue fleet had been in crisis for hours, aircraft cycling back to the inland depot one after another as the storm stretched their range past sustainable limits. The swimmer who'd flagged her had filed her location the moment they turned away. There were 6 other confirmed survivors within a mile. There was 1 operational helicopter. She didn't know any of that on the roof. On the roof, she just watched them go. She slid back down against the parapet wall, and the 11th contraction came, 7 minutes now, the interval tightening steadily, her body proceeding according to its own schedule with complete indifference to the circumstances. And she breathed through it, and when it passed, she put her forehead against her knees and stayed like that for a moment. She was not a woman who cried easily. Her mother had raised her in a small house in Beaufort, on a nurse's income and a philosophy that was never spoken aloud but was everywhere in that house, in the way her mother moved through problems, in the way she never sat down when she could stand and never complained about something she could still act on. You cry when you're done. You're not done yet. Evelyn was not done yet. She raised her head and looked out over the parapet wall at the drowned city. Savannah's skyline, what she could see of it through the rain, looked diminished. Lights gone in whole sections, the familiar water towers and church spires half obscured by low cloud and spray. She had walked these streets for 11 years. She had delivered babies in the hospital 6 blocks north of where she was sitting. She had bought groceries and argued with landlords and eventually bought the house on Magnolia Creek Drive, and believed with the stubborn and slightly delusional optimism of a person who has worked very hard for a normal life, that she'd built something real here. She heard the second helicopter before she saw it. Different sound from the Coast Guard bird. Lower frequency, heavier rotors, the mechanical signature of a larger aircraft running a more powerful engine. It came in from the northeast, running without the kind of strobing identification lights that government aircraft carry, and it descended over the intersection in a controlled hover that suggested a pilot who knew exactly what he was doing and was doing it in conditions that would have made most pilots land and wait. The searchlight found her again. She stood up. She didn't wave this time. She just stood there with both hands on the parapet wall and looked up at the aircraft because there was nothing else to do, and because something in the quality of the light or the way the helicopter held its position against the wind with absolute stillness made her go quiet inside in a way she didn't entirely understand. A door on the left side of the aircraft opened. A man stepped out onto the landing skid. He was big. She could see that even from this distance and through this rain, broad-shouldered in a dark jacket, no helmet, dark hair plastered flat against his forehead by the wind and the downwash from the rotors. He had a harness on and a line attached, and he moved along the skid without hesitation, without the tentative half-steps of someone who is afraid. And he looked down at her from whatever height separated them, 40 feet, maybe 50, with an expression she couldn't fully read but that contained, somewhere in it, something that was not surprise. He descended on the line, fast, controlled, the way someone descends when they've done it many times before, under conditions they didn't choose. The wind caught him twice and he corrected both times without visible effort. When his feet hit the roof, he unclipped the lower section of the harness and straightened up and walked toward her, and she saw his face clearly for the first time. 40, maybe. Dark eyes, deep set, the kind that don't give much away. A jaw that looked like it had been broken at least once and had healed with a slight offset. There was a scar that ran from the corner of his left eye to the edge of his jawline, thin and pale, the kind of scar that's old enough to have been forgotten by the person who carries it. He looked at her the way you look at a situation you're responsible for resolving. Clinical, assessing, already moving past the part where you ask if the problem is real and into the part where you solve it. He stopped 3 feet in front of her. He had to raise his voice to be heard over the rotors and the wind and the rain, but he didn't shout the way people shout when they're afraid. He just spoke louder, and the steadiness underneath the volume was the same regardless. "How far apart?" he said. She stared at him. "What?" "Contractions." How far apart? She blinked. Water ran down her face. 6, 7 minutes. He nodded once, like she'd answered a question on a form. He looked her over, not the way men sometimes looked her over, which she had developed a comprehensive interior catalog of responses to across 31 years of being a woman in the world, but the way she herself looked over patients, fast and thorough, cataloging what she could see and marking what she couldn't see for later. Can you walk? I walked out here. Can you still walk? Yes. He turned and looked up at the helicopter, made a hand signal she couldn't parse, and turned back. Harness goes around you here and here. He was already holding it out, already had it configured for her. She noticed that, filed it away. He'd thought about this before he came down. He'd thought about what she'd need. I'm going to clip you to me. You hold on. You don't let go regardless of what the wind does. The pilot's going to bring us up steady. You understand all of that? Who are you? She said. Someone who's getting you off this roof, he said. Everything else waits until we're in the air. She looked at him for another second, at the dark eyes that didn't flinch and the steady hands holding the harness. And then she looked at the drowned intersection below the parapet wall, at the moving brown water carrying wreckage past in the dark, at the city she'd lived in for 11 years being consumed by a storm that had no opinions about who it buried. She looked at the helicopter with no government markings holding its position in 40-mile-an-hour gusts like it had been bolted to the sky. She looked back at him. My bag, she said. Leave it. There are documents in there, my ID, the prenatal records. We have doctors, he said. Leave the bag. She let go of the bag. She let him put the harness on her. His hands moved quickly and without fumbling, adjusting straps, checking clips, running the connector line through the central ring, and testing it twice with a sharp downward pull that she felt in her chest. He clipped the line to his own harness, and when he did, the distance between them became technical, a matter of load-bearing hardware and rated cable, and she thought, I don't know this man. I don't know whose helicopter that is. I don't know what I'm agreeing to. She thought all of those things clearly and completely, and she looked at the water below and at the baby who was running on a schedule that was not going to wait for better options, and she made the calculation. Okay, she said. Hold here and here, he said. Don't look down. She looked down anyway. He didn't comment on it. The ascent was loud and cold, and the wind caught them twice, hard, and both times he absorbed it with his body, turning into it, using his weight as an anchor between her and the chaos. His arm was around her the whole way up. Not gentle exactly, but complete, the kind of grip that is about function rather than comfort, and that communicates something through that distinction. She held on to him and felt the baby shift again, felt the subtle seismic rearrangement of her own body under the influence of a life that was already making preparations to arrive. And she thought, I am 9 months pregnant and clipped to a stranger on a wire in a hurricane, and I have no money and no husband and no plan. She thought, my mother always said the good ones find you. She thought, I have no idea what this man is. They reached the helicopter door and 2 sets of hands pulled her inside and the door slid shut, and the noise dropped from catastrophic to merely severe, and she sat in a seat that was leather and clean and bolted to the floor of an aircraft that smelled of machine oil and something expensive, and the man sat across from her and looked at her the way he had on the roof. Assessing, contained, already past the part where he asked himself whether this was a problem worth solving. He said, 12 minutes to the facility. One of the doctors will meet us on the pad. What facility? She said. He looked out the window at the storm. Somewhere safe, he said. That's not an answer. He looked back at her. The scar along his jaw was more visible in the interior light. His dark eyes held something that might have been the beginning of something else, something less clinical. She wasn't sure, couldn't read it yet, hadn't yet developed the vocabulary for what she was looking at. No, he said. It isn't. The helicopter banked south and the lights of drowned savannah fell away beneath them, and Evelyn pressed both hands flat against her belly and breathed and counted and tried to build a picture of what she'd just agreed to, and found that the picture had edges she couldn't see past yet. 12 minutes. The 12th contraction came at the 9-minute mark. She breathed through it, and he watched her do it without looking away, which most people couldn't manage, and when it passed, he leaned forward slightly in his seat and said, quietly enough that the flight crew couldn't have heard, even if they'd been listening, "My name is Dominic DeLuca." She knew that name. Everyone in the eastern seaboard knew that name. She looked at him across the narrow interior of the helicopter, at the dark eyes and the broken jaw, and the complete, almost architectural stillness of a man who had been many things and had survived them all, and felt the next contraction beginning its slow, inexorable pull before she'd even finished processing the last one and thought, "Oh." And then, what has he just saved me for? The helicopter set down on a rooftop pad ringed with floodlights, and even before the rotors had fully cycled down, the door was open and two men in scrubs were there with a gurney and a face that Evelyn recognized as professional urgency, the specific controlled hurry of medical people who have been told something is coming and have prepared accordingly. She tried to stand up on her own. "Ma'am, I can walk," she said. She couldn't, quite. Her legs had gone wrong somewhere between the roof and the helicopter, had lost the reliable solidity she'd taken for granted for 31 years, and when her feet hit the rooftop surface, she had to put one hand on the gurney rail to stay upright. The wind up here was still significant. They were 6, 7 stories up, and Hurricane Iris was still chewing through the coast 40 miles south, still sending its outer bands across the city in long horizontal curtains of rain. She stood in that rain with her hand on the gurney rail and her jaw set and breathed through the tail end of a contraction that had started on the helicopter and was only now releasing. When it released, she looked up. Dominic DeLuca was standing 6 feet away, watching her with his hands in the pockets of his jacket and his face doing the thing it did. That quality of absolute non-disclosure, of a man who has trained himself to give nothing away and has been at it long enough that it no longer requires effort. He was soaking wet. The rain had flattened his hair against his forehead, and his jacket was dark with water from collar to hem, and he didn't appear to notice any of it. "I can walk," she said again, to him this time. "Nobody said you couldn't," he said. She let them put her on the gurney anyway, because the next contraction was already building at the base of her spine, and she was not going to fall down on this man's rooftop. She had limits, and she had pride, and she was currently operating at the intersection of both. The facility was not a hospital. That was the first thing she understood when they wheeled her inside. It had the equipment of a hospital, the monitoring stations, the IV poles, the sealed cabinets with their neat rows of labeled medications. But hospitals had a particular smell that came from industrial cleaning products and institutional food and the accumulated presence of sick and frightened people. And this place smelled of something cooler and more controlled, like the air itself had been filtered and recirculated to remove any trace of chaos. The lights were warm rather than the blue-white fluorescent wash she'd spent 11 years working under. The floors were polished concrete rather than linoleum. Private medical center. The kind that existed at a remove from the public system, that operated on a different set of assumptions about what patients deserved and what problems money could solve. The doctor who met them was a woman in her late 40s named Carver. She gave only the last name, offered it briskly with a handshake that was brief and dry and professional. She had gray-streaked hair pulled back hard and the kind of eyes that assessed and moved on so quickly you almost missed the assessment happening. "How far along?" Carver said, not a question, already reaching for the monitoring equipment. 39.4, Evelyn said. "Contractions every 6 minutes, started approximately 4 hours ago. Waters haven't broken. Baby was head down at my last appointment 12 days ago. I'm a maternity nurse. I know what I'm looking at." Carver looked at her with the faint, involuntary adjustment of someone recalibrating. "Good," she said. "Then I don't have to explain what the monitor's telling us." "No," Evelyn said. "You don't." They looked at each other for a moment, two women in a professional register that had its own language, its own compressed shorthand, and then Carver nodded once, and they got to work. Dominic did not come into the room. She noticed that. She noticed it the way you notice things when your body is doing something enormous, and your mind, in self-defense, fixates on the small and the observable. He had walked her to the door of the room and stopped at the threshold and said, "Carver's the best I have." And then he had stepped back and let the door close, and she had not seen him again for 9 hours. She thought about that during the labor, during the parts of it that allowed thought, which were fewer and farther between as the hours progressed. She thought about the way he'd stepped back from the threshold, not dismissed, not indifferent, deliberate, like a man who understood the difference between the spaces he was welcome in and the ones he wasn't, and had made a decision about which category this was. She found that she did not know what to do with that. The baby came at 4:17 in the morning. She came quietly, which surprised everyone, including Carver, who had been braced for the kind of final push that announces itself. Instead, the last contraction resolved into a stillness, and in that stillness, a small and furious person arrived and immediately made clear she had a great deal to say about the situation. The cry was strong and high and indignant, the cry of someone who has been in transit for too long and has opinions about the conditions. Evelyn held her against her chest and felt the baby's heart thumping against her own, fast, strong, its own distinct rhythm, and said nothing for a long time. Carver and the nurses moved around her with their efficient postpartum choreography, and she was aware of all of it and present for none of it. She was looking at the small, red, furious face pressed against her sternum and thinking about the rooftop and the zero balance in the savings account and the 14 unanswered calls. And she was thinking about her mother's voice saying, "The good ones always find each other." And she was thinking, "I'm going to call you Hope." She didn't say it out loud. Not yet. It felt like something that needed to be decided in private, in the quiet of a room where no one else could weigh in on it. The name felt like a statement she was making to herself and to the small person on her chest, a declaration about what she intended to carry forward from the worst night of her life. Hope. Yeah. She was still awake when Dominic knocked. It was just after 6 in the morning. The storm had quieted outside. She could hear it diminishing, the wind dropping to something merely severe, the rain losing its percussive intensity. Hope was sleeping in the bassinet Carver's team had provided, asleep with the terrifying total commitment that newborns bring to everything, her small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that Evelyn had already memorized. She said, "Come in." He opened the door and stood in the doorway for a moment, the same threshold pause, she noticed, before he stepped inside. He'd changed out of the wet jacket. He was wearing a dark shirt now, no tie, the collar open. He still looked like someone who didn't sleep, but there were different qualities of not sleeping, and his was the functional kind, the kind that comes from habit rather than distress. He looked at Hope in the bassinet. Something moved across his face and was gone before she could name it. "She's healthy," he said. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, strong lungs. Evelyn paused. "Her name is Hope." He looked at her when she said that. The something crossed his face again, slower this time, and she almost caught it. "That's a good name," he said. "I know it is." He pulled a chair to a careful distance, close enough to talk, far enough to be unambiguous about what kind of conversation this was, and sat down and put his forearms on his knees and looked at her. She looked back. Outside the window, the pre-dawn sky was the dirty pink of a bruise healing, the cloud cover breaking apart in long strips to reveal the first colorless light. "You know who I am," he said. "Yes." "Then you have questions." "Several," she said. "Starting with why." He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone stalling, but the silence of someone who is deciding how much of a true answer they're willing to give, and where the true answer starts and the manageable version of it ends. She recognized that silence too. She'd sat with patients' families in it many times. "I had a helicopter and a pilot who could fly in it," he said. "You were on a roof." "There were 6 other survivors within a mile," she said. "Apparently. I found that out later. Did you get all of them?" A pause. 3 others. 2 we couldn't reach in time." She absorbed that. "So it wasn't random," she said. "No." "Then what was it?" He looked at her steadily. "I knew where you were," he said. "I had information the Coast Guard didn't have yet. I made a choice to use it." "What kind of information?" "The kind I'm not going to explain at 6 in the morning the day after you gave birth." She studied him, the broken jaw, the scar, the dark eyes that gave you enough to know there was more being held back, which was somehow more unsettling than a face that gave you nothing at all. "All right," she said. "Different question. How long am I here?" as long as you need to be. That's also not an answer. The city's not accessible, he said. Roads are out, power's down across 6 grid sections. The hospital where you work took 8 feet of water in the ground floor. Until things are navigable, you're here. And after that? He looked at her in a way that suggested the answer to that question was more complicated than the question itself had been, and that he was aware of the complication, and that he was not going to resolve it at 6 in the morning at the end of the worst night she'd had in her adult life. After that, we'll talk, he said. By the second day, she'd mapped the facility. It was what she did when she didn't know something. She gathered information, systematically, the way her mother had taught her to gather it, through observation rather than direct question when observation was available. She walked the corridors with hope in the rolling bassinet and noted the exits and the camera positions and the men who stood at certain intersections in a way that was meant to look casual and didn't quite succeed. She counted 8 of them on the route she walked. She suspected there were more on routes she hadn't walked. The facility occupied the top 3 floors of what appeared to be a converted warehouse building in a part of the city she didn't immediately recognize. The floodwaters had altered the street-level landmarks enough that she couldn't triangulate her position from the windows, and the windows were tinted dark enough to obscure detail at distance. She noted that, too. On the afternoon of the second day, Dominic's head of security came to tell her she couldn't access the East Corridor. He was a man named Ruiz. She'd already learned that much from listening. Compact and precise in his movements, with a flat, watchful quality that reminded her of a dog trained to be quiet until it wasn't. He stood in the hallway outside her room and told her the East Corridor was restricted and that she'd be more comfortable staying in the western section of the facility. More comfortable, she said. Yes, ma'am. Or you'd be more comfortable if I stayed in the western section. Ruiz looked at her. Both, ideally. What's in the East Corridor? Nothing that concerns you. Then why does it need restricting? Ma'am, Ruiz said, with the tone of a man who is deployed to win arguments through patience rather than logic. The West Wing has everything you need, kitchen, outdoor terrace, the nursery we set up. Mr. DeLuca asked me to make sure you had whatever you need. What I need, she said, is to understand where I am. You're safe, he said. That's what matters right now. She looked at him for a moment, at the flat, watchful eyes and the careful posture of a man who was very good at revealing exactly as much as he was authorized to reveal, and nothing beyond it. And then she said, Tell Mr. DeLuca I'd like to speak with him this evening, and went back into her room. What was in the East Corridor, she found out, was not nothing. She found out at 3 in the morning on the third night, when Hope woke for a feeding and Evelyn was awake anyway, sitting in the chair by the window with her daughter latched and the room dark and quiet, when she heard voices from the direction of the restricted corridor. Not loud voices, controlled ones. The specific controlled register of men having an argument they've agreed not to have loudly. She couldn't make out words at first. Then a door opened somewhere and the voices sharpened. Can't keep her here indefinitely. A voice she didn't know. Older, with an accent she placed somewhere in the mid-Atlantic corridor. Dominic's voice. I'm not keeping her anywhere. She has nowhere to go. That's not our problem. The moment she's mobile, she's 3 days postpartum, Vincent. I'm aware of what she is. What she is a liability. She's connected to the coal transactions. If Hargrove's people find that out, I found it out first. A pause, something shifting in the quality of the silence between them. That's why she's here. Dominic, the older voice, Vincent, had dropped into something quieter and more serious. You pulled a civilian out of a flood. I understand that impulse, believe me, but she's not just a civilian anymore. She's the wife of a man who has his name on documents that could... Estranged wife. Does Hargrove's cleanup crew know the distinction? The door closed again and the voices disappeared. Evelyn sat in the dark with her daughter nursing and her mind running the new information through the architecture of everything she thought she understood. Travis. The transactions. Hargrove. She didn't know the name Hargrove, but she knew Travis's transactions, had lived alongside them for 3 years without understanding what she was living alongside. The savings account. The wire transfers he'd described as consulting fees from clients she'd never met. The secondary phone she'd found once 2 years ago and accepted his explanation for in the way you accept explanations when the alternative is a truth you're not ready to sit with. She looked down at Hope's face, eyes closed, the complete animal trust of a creature who has arrived somewhere and has decided, on no evidence whatsoever, that it is safe. What has he just saved me for? She'd asked herself that question on the helicopter, in the dark and the noise, clipped to a man whose name she knew, the way you know the names of weather systems and natural disasters, by reputation, by the damage they leave, by the careful way people talk about them in public and differently in private. She was beginning to think the answer was more specific than she'd understood. She confronted him the next morning, not with the dramatics the word implied. She didn't corner him, didn't raise her voice, didn't perform the scene the way it would have played in a different kind of story. She waited until he came to the western wing for the coffee he apparently drank at 7 every morning standing at the kitchen window, and she walked in and put Hope in the small seat Carver's team had provided and sat down across the table from him and said, "Travis's transactions." He went very still. Not the controlled stillness she'd seen on the rooftop and in the helicopter and in the recovery room. This was a different quality of stillness, the stillness of a man who has been caught arriving at something faster than he expected. He set down his coffee cup. "What did you hear?" he said. "Enough." She held his gaze. "You're not going to ask me how I heard it because you know the walls in this building are doing the minimum required by physics. You're going to tell me what Travis's name is on." He looked at her for a moment, the dark eyes, the thing he kept behind them. Then he said, "How much do you want to know?" "All of it." "People who know all of it have been disappearing for the last 2 weeks." "I'm already here," she said, "wherever here is. I'm already in whatever this is. You made that decision when you put me on that helicopter, not me. So you don't get to manage what I know now." He picked up the coffee cup again and looked at it and set it down without drinking from it. "Travis Cole has been running money," he said, "for the last 4 years, small amounts. Nothing that triggers the automatic flags, but consistent. Offshore routing through 3 shell entities that were set up before your hurricane season, specifically to handle the flow from the disaster relief funds." She kept her face even. "He's not the architect," Dominic continued. "He's a conduit, a relatively low-level one, but his name is on the transfer authorizations and his signature is on documents that connect the conduit to a man named Hargrove. State Emergency Management Director, appointed 18 months ago, confirmed unanimously by a committee that received significant donations from 2 of the shell entities. The documents that carry Travis's signature are the only surviving paper trail that connects Hargrove directly to the theft. The theft. She held the word in her mind. Not embezzlement, not misappropriation. Theft. The word he'd chosen and the weight he'd put on it. "How much?" she said. "Current estimate? 40 million, possibly more as the auditors get further in." He paused. "The storm made it easier. Emergency appropriations move fast, oversight thins out. The contractors who win the bids are the ones who were expecting to win them. It was planned around Iris. They knew the storm was coming, and they built the mechanism in advance." The room felt very quiet. Hope made a small sound in the seat, and Evelyn reached over without looking and put one hand on the seat's frame and rocked it gently. "Travis knew," she said. It wasn't a question. Travis knew the minimum he needed to know to do his part. Whether he understood the full scope, he knew, she said. "He's not stupid. He's not a lot of things I thought he was, but he's not stupid." Dominic looked at her with something that might have been, in a different man, an expression of sympathy. In him, it was something more like recognition, the specific acknowledgement of one person who knows how to read a situation clearly for another person who is doing exactly that and finding the terrain worse than expected. "The people running cleanup for Hargrove know that the paper trail exists," he said. "They've been working through the list of people who've seen the documents. 3 accountants, 1 paralegal, an assistant state auditor." He stopped. "They've all been dealt with." She understood what dealt with meant. "Travis gave them my name," she said. "We believe he gave them your connection to the accounts. Whether he understood what that would mean? He gave them my name," she said again, flatly, without inflection, because the absence of inflection was the only way she could say it right now without something she didn't want to happen happening. Dominic did not try to soften it. Yes, he said. Hope made another sound. Evelyn looked at her daughter. The small face, the closed eyes, the extraordinary unconscious peacefulness of someone who had been in the world for 4 days and had not yet learned what the world contained. So, she said, the helicopter. I was already looking for the documents, Dominic said. My operation has been running parallel to the federal investigation for 6 months. We identified Travis as a link in the chain 8 weeks ago, when the storm hit and he disappeared and your name came up on Hargrove's cleanup list. He stopped. I knew where you were because I had surveillance on Travis's movements. He'd already left the city when I found your location. You were watching my husband. I was watching a man who had information I needed. And I was, she stopped, worked it through. Collateral. I was collateral you decided to pick up. You were a pregnant woman on a roof in a Category 5 hurricane, he said. I had a helicopter. Don't do that, she said. Don't make it simple when it isn't. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the window, the sky over Savannah was the pale, exhausted gray of the morning after a disaster, the kind of sky that has used up all its color and drama and is now just sky again, just weather, just the ordinary atmosphere of a world that keeps going regardless. No, he said, it isn't simple. I want to see the documents, she said. Evelyn, I know Travis's handwriting, I know his signature, I know the formatting he uses on authorization forms, because I used to help him file quarterly tax documents, and his filing system was a disaster, and I rebuilt it for him. She held Dominic's gaze. If you have paper trail, I can tell you what's his and what's been fabricated. That has value. You know it has value, or you wouldn't have had the conversation with Vincent about whether I'm a liability. His jaw tightened fractionally. The scar along the edge of it went white. You weren't supposed to hear that conversation, he said. And yet, she said. He was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Hope slept in the seat, and the morning light fell across the table between them, and Evelyn did not look away from his face because she had learned, a long time ago, that the moment you look away is the moment you lose the ground you're standing on, and she had very little ground left, and she was not going to give up any of it. This afternoon, he said finally, I'll have Ruiz bring you what we have. I want to see everything, she said. You'll see what's relevant. Everything is relevant. Evelyn. He said her name the way people say a name when they want you to understand that the conversation has reached the boundary of what they're going to give, that the next step past this point is somewhere neither of them has been yet. I will show you what I can, and in return, you'll tell me what you can verify. That's the arrangement. She thought about the word arrangement and what it meant in the mouth of a man like this. Not a contract, not a deal, not a partnership, but something older and less documented, something that operated on the architecture of mutual utility and the specific kind of trust that gets built not through affection, but through the slow accumulation of proven necessity. All right, she said, but I want something else first. What? I want to know why Vincent called me a liability and you didn't agree with him. The question sat in the air between them. He looked at her across the table with the dark eyes that gave you just enough and held back everything else. And she watched him decide, watched the actual moment of it, the slight shift in his expression that preceded a decision, the micro-adjustment of a man who has made 1,000 decisions under pressure and knows what it feels like when one matters more than the others. He said, because Hargrove's people have already found the rooftop. She felt the air in the room change. They found the Coast Guard's log of your position, he said. They know someone pulled you out. They're working backward from the rescue to identify who. He paused. They're going to find out it was me. When they do, I'm not just connected to Travis anymore, she said. I'm connected to you. Yes, which means, he said, that there is no version of this where you walk out of here and go back to the way things were 3 days ago. Hargrove's people will find you regardless of where you go. The only variable is whether you have protection when they do. She looked at her daughter. She looked at the man across the table. The man who had come down a wire in a hurricane for reasons that were never entirely simple, that had always had layers she was only now beginning to see, that had put her in a room that was safe and a situation that was not, and who was now sitting across a kitchen table from her telling her the truth with the specific quality of honesty that comes not from virtue, but from the recognition that the truth is the only thing that serves both of them now. "You should have told me this on the first day," she said. "You'd just given birth," he said. "I've been a nurse for 11 years, she said. "I've delivered bad news to people 6 hours postpartum. They can handle it." "I know," he said, "but I made a different call." She absorbed that. "Dominic," she said, and it was the first time she'd used his name, and she heard it land between them with a weight she hadn't entirely intended. "If I help you build this case, if I verify the documents, if I give you Travis's signature authentication, if I become the witness that connects Hargrove to the money, there's no version of that where I come out the other side of this as someone who just walked away, is there?" He held her gaze. "No," he said, "there isn't." Outside the window, the pale morning was hardening into something more definite. The sky committing to a color. The city below beginning to make its first sounds of a world trying to resume. Somewhere in Savannah, Evelyn knew, there were people in Hargrove's operation pulling a thread that led to a rooftop at the intersection of Dunmore and Calhoun, and from there to a helicopter with a silver crest, and from there to this building, and to a kitchen table where a woman who had been a maternity nurse 4 days ago was being asked, without quite being asked, whether she was willing to become something else. She looked at Hope. She looked at Dominic. She said, "Show me the documents." And in the east corridor, 20 feet away on the other side of a wall that was doing the minimum required by physics, Ruiz's radio crackled once, and his voice came through tight and controlled and stripped of everything except the information itself. "We have a vehicle at the perimeter. Dark SUV, no plates. It's been sitting there for 11 minutes. Dominic was on his feet before Ruiz finished the sentence, and the kitchen table between them and the pale morning sky and the careful architecture of the conversation they'd just finished was already behind them, already past, because something had just changed and they were both already inside it. And neither of them was going to be the same person they'd been 11 minutes ago when the SUV pulled up and a decision got made somewhere that the thread had been followed far enough. Ruiz was already moving through the corridor when Dominic reached him, the two of them falling into the compressed, efficient communication of men who have done this before. Not the choreography of rehearsal, but the instinct of repetition, of situations that have a shape you recognize even when the specific details change. "How many in the vehicle?" Dominic said. "Can't confirm. Windows are blacked out. Driver hasn't moved." Ruiz had his radio in one hand and his eyes on the monitor mounted to the wall at the corridor junction. A feed from the exterior cameras, 4 quadrants, the SUV visible in the lower left, sitting at the perimeter gate on the building's south side, like something that had decided to wait. Plates. Pulled, literally pulled. You can see the brackets empty. Dominic looked at the monitor. Dark SUV, sitting, not approaching, not leaving, just present in the particular way that things are present when their presence is itself the message. "Get Carver," he said. "Move the woman and the baby to the interior room. No windows." "Already on it. And get me Chen." Ruiz was gone before the sentence finished. Dominic stood in front of the monitor and looked at the vehicle for exactly 10 seconds. He was a man who could be precise about intervals, who had trained himself to be, because imprecision in moments like this was how you lost things you couldn't get back. And then he turned and walked back toward the kitchen. Evelyn was still at the table. She hadn't moved. Hope was in the seat in front of her, and Evelyn had one hand resting on the seat's frame, and she was looking at Dominic with the expression of a woman who has already processed the implication of what she just heard and has arrived at the far side of it and is now waiting to understand what comes next. Her face was composed in the particular way that faces are composed when composure is a choice being actively made rather than a natural state. "Interior room," he said. "Now." "What's happening?" "I don't know yet. Move." "Don't." She stood up, picking up the seat with Hope in it in a single practiced motion that had the confidence of 4 days of learning. "Don't tell me to move without telling me what I'm moving from." "Evelyn. Is it Hargrove's people?" "I don't know yet." "Best guess." He looked at her. She looked back. The kitchen had a window, and the window was facing the wrong direction, and he could feel that wrongness in a way that was physical, a low-level alertness that had kept him alive across 15 years of situations that started with a vehicle at a perimeter and had various endings. "Best guess," he said. "Yes." She moved. The interior room was on the north side of the building. No exterior windows, a former record storage space that had been converted at some point into a secondary medical bay. Metal shelving along one wall, a cot, monitoring equipment in a corner. The air had the slightly stale quality of a room that doesn't get opened often enough. Carver was already there when Evelyn arrived, setting up the portable monitor with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been in emergency situations before and had a hierarchy for them. She looked up when Evelyn came in and said, "Put her on the cot," meaning Hope, and Evelyn put the seat on the cot and then straightened up and turned to look at the door. "Stay back from the door," Carver said. "I know," Evelyn said. They stood in the room and listened to the building. Footsteps in the corridor, controlled, purposeful, more than two sets. The low frequency of male voices having conversations too quiet to resolve into words. The crackle of radios. A door closing somewhere with a sound that had weight behind it. Hope slept through all of it. Evelyn stood in the center of the room with her arms crossed over her chest and her jaw set, and looked at the closed door and thought about what she'd heard Dominic say. They're working backward from the rescue to identify who, and thought about the zero balance in the savings account, and thought about Travis in a way that had the specific quality of thought that comes after the grief burns off, and what's left underneath is something colder and more durable. He'd given them her name. She'd understood it when Dominic said it, and she'd held it at arm's length since then. The way you hold certain truths at arm's length, not because you don't believe them, but because you're rationing how much of them you let in at once. She was letting more of it in now, standing in a room with no windows while the building moved around her with the specific urgency of men preparing for something. Travis had known. He'd taken the money, he'd built the mechanism, he'd run the transfers, and when the storm hit and the whole architecture threatened to fall, he had drained the last account and handed her name to people who dealt with problems by removing them. He'd handed her name to them while she was 9 months pregnant and alone in a flooding house, and then he'd gotten in a car with his mistress and driven north. She uncrossed her arms and crossed them again differently, tighter, and breathed. "You cry when you're done. You're not done yet." The vehicle sat at the perimeter for 47 minutes and then left. Dominic came to the interior room 20 minutes after that and opened the door and said, "Clear." And Evelyn looked at his face and noted that clear did not mean what clear usually meant on his face. "They left," she said. "Yes." "That's not good, is it?" He stepped inside. He had his phone in one hand and the look of a man who has received information and is still working it through the part of his mind that translates information into action. "They got what they came for," he said. The vehicle had a camera array, high resolution, directional. They were photographing everyone who moved on this building's exterior in the window they sat there. "They identified your people." "Some of them. Possibly." He looked at Hope in the seat on the cot. "And they confirmed someone is here who isn't usually here." Carver, who had stayed in the room, said, "How did they find this location?" Dominic looked at her. Then he looked away. That look, the half second of it, the angle of his eyes moving off Carver's face, told Evelyn something. She filed it without commenting on it. "We're moving tonight," Dominic said. "Different location. I want both of you ready by 8. "The baby is 5 days old," Carver said. "I know how old she is." Moving a 5-day-old in the middle of Carver. His voice didn't rise. It just became something else. Not louder, but more fundamental. The quality of a voice that expects to be the last word. "Get her ready to move." Carver looked at him for a moment with the expression of a woman who has worked for difficult men long enough to know which arguments to save. Then she turned to her equipment. Evelyn watched all of this. She said, "How did they find this location?" Dominic looked at her. "I'm working on that." That's also not an answer. "No," he said. "It isn't. Not yet." They moved at 8:14 in the evening, through streets that were still navigating the aftermath of Iris. Debris cleared to the roadsides in long berms, traffic lights dark at half the intersections. The occasional military vehicle parked at intervals that Evelyn recognized as the National Guard postings she'd seen on the news during previous storm responses. The convoy was 3 vehicles, Evelyn and Hope in the middle one with Carver, and 2 of Ruiz's people in the front and rear. Dominic was not in her vehicle. She noticed that too. The new location was a house in a neighborhood she didn't recognize. Large, set back from the street behind a gate, and mature trees that had survived Iris better than most of the city. The kind of neighborhood where the infrastructure was private and maintained and therefore more resilient than whatever the county managed. The house itself was older, probably 1940s, brick, with the settled quality of a structure that had been built when people still built things to outlast the people who built them. She was shown to a room on the 2nd floor, larger than the one at the facility. An actual window, though the shutters were closed and latched. A crib. Not the medical bassinet, but an actual crib, wood, solid, that had clearly been placed here recently because she could still see the faint marks on the floor where it had been dragged from the corner to the center of the room. Someone had prepared for her arrival in advance of the decision to move. She stood in the room with Hope and looked at the crib and thought about what that meant. She found the documents the next morning, not because anyone showed them to her, Dominic had said this afternoon. And then the afternoon had become an evening of movement, and the documents had not materialized. She found them because she was awake at 5 in the morning, and Hope was sleeping, and the house was quiet in the way houses are quiet when the people in them are asleep. And she had walked downstairs to find something to eat, and had passed an open door on the ground floor. The room beyond it was a study. A desk, a laptop, 2 monitors, and on the desk a manila folder that had been left open. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looked at the folder, walked in. The documents were financial transfer authorizations, 12 pages, photocopied. The originals presumably somewhere else. She could see immediately that they were real, not because she was a forensic accountant, but because Travis's handwriting had a specific quality that she had spent 3 years living alongside, a forward slant that was slightly more aggressive than his general personality suggested, the letters compressed at the end of words as though he ran out of patience finishing them. She'd teased him about it once. He'd laughed. She stood at the desk and went through the pages one by one. His signature was on 8 of the 12. 3 of those 8 had additional notations in the margin, amounts, routing codes, that were also in his hand. The amounts were not small. The largest single authorization she could see was $4,200,000 routed through an entity called Coastal Recovery Partners, LLC, dated 6 weeks before Hurricane Iris made landfall. 6 weeks before. She set the page down, picked it up again, looked at the date. The money had moved 6 weeks before the storm hit. The accounts had been established. The routing had been configured. The authorization signatures had been obtained. All of it, before the hurricane existed anywhere except in the atmospheric models that a small number of meteorologists and a somewhat larger number of people who paid attention to meteorologists could access and interpret. Travis had known Iris was coming, not in the way that anyone who watches the news in August on the Carolina coast knows that a storm is coming, in the specific way, with the specific advance knowledge that meant he'd been briefed, which meant someone had briefed him, which meant the people running this operation had access to information about storm trajectories that preceded the public forecasts. She stood at the desk in the quiet study at 5 in the morning and understood, with the complete and terrible clarity of a person who has assembled enough pieces to see the shape of the whole, that what Travis had been involved in was not opportunistic. It was designed. Someone had looked at the hurricane season's projections, had identified the most probable major landfall on the Atlantic seaboard, and had built the mechanism for stealing the relief money in advance of the disaster they were planning to profit from. The storm hadn't come to them. They'd been waiting for it. "You weren't supposed to be in here." She turned. Vincent was standing in the doorway. She hadn't heard him. He moved quietly for a man his age, which she put it somewhere in the middle 60s, with silver hair and the kind of face that had probably been described as distinguished at some point and was now simply lined. He was wearing a dark robe over his clothes, which meant he'd been awake, which meant he'd seen the light under the study door. He was looking at the folder in her hands with an expression that was several things at once. "I know," she said. The door was open. That wasn't an invitation. No. She set the folder on the desk. Who is Vincent? A pause. Vincent Mara. I'm Dominic's. I manage certain aspects of the organization's affairs. Legal counsel? Among other things. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside the study window, the pre-dawn street was silent and dark, the trees along it still and enormous. The authorizations are dated 6 weeks before Iris, she said. He said nothing. That's not coincidence, she said. That's foreknowledge. Someone knew Iris was going to hit this coast specifically 6 weeks out before any public forecast had it above a 50% probability. That's not available information. She stopped. That's either classified meteorological data or it's someone inside FEMA's predictive modeling program. Vincent looked at her with the expression of a man recalculating something. You're smarter than Dominic described, he said. Dominic described me as a maternity nurse. Yes, Vincent said. He did. She held his gaze. Who has access to FEMA's predictive models 6 weeks in advance? People with very specific appointments, Vincent said carefully. Senior-level appointments, the kind that are made by governors or confirmed through emergency management committees. Hargrove, she said. Vincent was quiet for a moment. That was its own answer. And who else, she said. Because Hargrove's a state appointment. 6 weeks of advance access to a federal predictive model means someone above the state level was involved. Vincent looked at her for a long time. The lined face, the silver hair, the expression of a man who is making a decision about how much of a truth to release into a room and whether the room can hold it. There are federal names on this, he said finally. Yes. She felt the room shift. How high, she said. High enough, Vincent said, that the moment those names become part of a provable case, the people attached to them will use everything available to eliminate the case before it reaches a prosecutor. High enough that 3 federal investigators who got close to this in the last 4 months have been transferred, discredited, or... He stopped. Or dealt with, she said. The phrase Dominic had used. Yes. She looked at the folder on the desk, at Travis's signature on the pages, the compressed letters at the ends of words, the forward slant she knew as well as she knew her own hands. Dominic's been building this case for 6 months, she said. He has the documents. He has the chain. Why hasn't he moved? Because the chain has a gap, Vincent said. The transfer authorizations prove Hargrove's mechanism. They don't prove the knowledge, the foreknowledge. Without the forecasting data, a defense attorney turns the timeline into coincidence inside of 40 minutes. What we need is the source of the meteorological intelligence. The internal document that shows someone accessed the FEMA predictive model before the public forecast and shared that data with the principals. And you don't have it. We knew it existed. We had a contact inside FEMA's regional office who confirmed its existence and agreed to provide access. Vincent paused. He looked at the window. He looked back at her. That contact was killed in a car accident 11 days ago, 2 days before the storm made landfall. The room went very quiet. Evelyn thought about 11 days ago. She'd been in the house on Magnolia Creek Drive 11 days ago, working a double shift and eating takeout at the kitchen table because Travis had been out of town for a conference, and she'd been tired enough that cooking felt like an abstraction. She'd been 37 weeks pregnant and thinking about the hospital bag she needed to pack and the car seat she needed to install and the 17 things on her to-do list that had nothing to do with the fact that a man who had agreed to expose a multi-million-dollar fraud operation had been killed in a car that was not an accident. The document still exists, she said, presumably, somewhere in the FEMA regional system. And without it, the case doesn't hold. Without it, the case falls apart the moment it goes to a judge who has been recommended to his seat by someone whose name appears on the chain. She breathed. She looked at Travis's signature on the page and thought about the person who had signed those pages, the person she had eaten breakfast with for 3 years, the person who had put her name on a list and driven north with a woman she'd never known existed. Travis knows who the federal contact was, she said. Vincent looked at her sharply. He processed the authorizations, she said. He was the routing mechanism. The foreknowledge had to come through the same channel as the instructions. He would have handled correspondence from whoever provided the meteorological data. If anyone below Hargrove's level knows the name of the federal principal, it's Travis. Vincent was very still. You need Travis, she said. Dominic has been trying to locate Travis since he disappeared, Vincent said. He cleared out of the city before the storm. Beyond that, I know where he'd go, she said. The words were out before she'd fully decided to say them. She heard them land in the room and felt the shift in the air that came with them. The shift of something that could not be unsaid, that had changed the geometry of the conversation and of her position inside it irreversibly. Vincent looked at her. His mother, she said. Travis's mother lives in Asheville. She's the only person he's ever run to when things went wrong. He doesn't know how to be afraid by himself. He needs someone to manage him through it. She paused. He'll be in Asheville. She told Dominic at 7 in the morning. He had come in through the back of the house, she learned later, which was why she hadn't heard him arrive. He'd been at the facility overnight, dealing with the aftermath of the perimeter breach. And he came into the kitchen of the house looking like a man who had not slept and had stopped expecting to and had made peace with that some hours ago. He was wearing the same shirt from the previous day. There was a cut on the back of his left hand, small, recent, the kind of cut that comes from moving through something fast and not stopping to account for edges. He looked at her when he came in, and then he looked at the coffee she'd made, and then he poured a cup and stood at the counter and drank half of it before he spoke. Vincent told you about the gap in the chain, he said. Not a question. He didn't intend to. But he did. Yes. Dominic set the cup down and looked at her and said, You found the folder. The door was open. It was left open, he said, by someone. She looked at him. He looked at her. The kitchen was morning quiet, Hope asleep upstairs, the house around them carrying the specific silence of a place that holds its breath. Ruiz, she said. Ruiz left the door open. Dominic's expression didn't change. Ruiz has worked for me for 9 years, he said. I know. We grew up 6 blocks from each other. I know, she said. And Ruiz was the only person who knew the location of the facility before we moved, and the vehicle found the facility. The silence in the kitchen was a different quality now. He wouldn't, Dominic started. I'm not saying he did it willingly. She kept her voice even. This was the hardest kind of truth to deliver. Not the truth that was about the person you were talking to, but the truth that was about someone they'd kept close. She delivered this kind of truth at bedsides before. You didn't soften it because softening it changed its shape. I'm saying that the vehicle sat at the perimeter for 47 minutes with a camera array and left without making contact. They weren't trying to breach the facility. They were sending a message to someone inside the facility. They were telling someone inside that they knew where he was and that he needed to make a choice. Dominic stood very still. And then someone left a folder open with the core documents of your case in a room I could walk into at 5 in the morning, she said, either to test what I'd do with them or to make sure I understood enough to be useful in a way that forces a faster timeline. Faster than what? Faster than whatever Ruiz has been promised is coming for him if he doesn't move the case to a position where it can be neutralized. She stopped. He's not trying to destroy you. He's trying to survive something that has him cornered. And whoever has him cornered has been smart enough to give him a way out that looks like loyalty. Dominic turned away from her. He put both hands on the counter and looked at the window above the sink and was very quiet for a long time. She waited. This was also something she knew how to do, to wait while someone processed a thing that cost them something, without filling the silence with noise, without making the processing about her own discomfort. When he turned back, his face had changed, not broken. Nothing about his face broke. She was coming to understand that about him, that whatever pressure was applied to it, the fundamental structure remained, but something in the composition of it had shifted, some internal alignment that had been one thing was now another, and the eyes had the quality of someone who has stepped past a line and knows it. How long? He said. His voice was the same, only the eyes were different. I don't know, she said. Long enough for them to have positioned him. He picked up his phone. He stood there for a moment with the phone in his hand and his thumb over the screen, and she could see him running through it. The sequence of calls, the order of moves, what he'd say to Ruiz and what that conversation would cost and what came after it. Travis is in Asheville, she said, his mother's house. I can get him to meet me. Dominic looked up from the phone. He doesn't know I know about the list, she said. He doesn't know how much I know about any of it. As far as he's aware, I'm a woman who survived a flood with a baby and has no idea what he was involved in. She met his gaze. He'll meet me. He'll feel guilty enough to meet me and smart enough to think the meeting is safe. And when he does, you can get the federal name. You're not doing that. You need the name, she said. You have a gap in your chain and a man inside your operation who is compromised in a window that is closing because whoever has Ruiz in a corner knows you're close. You need the name, and I'm the fastest way to get to the person who has it. She paused. I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you what I'm going to do and giving you the opportunity to make it organized. He stared at her. You've been a maternity nurse for 11 years, he said. Yes, she said. And I've spent 11 years watching what happens when people don't act fast enough. She thought about the families in waiting rooms, the decisions made in hallways, the specific texture of a moment when the window closes and doesn't open again. I know what it looks like when there's no more time to be careful. Dominic looked at her for a long time. The dark eyes had something in them that was new. Not warmth, not exactly, but something that operated in warmth's vicinity, something adjacent to it that had its own specific gravity. He said, We do it my way. I don't know what your way is yet, she said. No, he said, but you're about to. He raised the phone and called Ruiz and said, Come to the kitchen, in a voice that was entirely level, and when he lowered the phone, she could see his hand was steady, and the cut on the back of it had stopped bleeding, and he was already somewhere past what this was going to cost him, already operating in the space beyond the loss, and she understood that this was what he was, a man who moved through necessary things without the luxury of staying in them, who had trained himself to absorb and continue because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was the one thing he had never allowed himself. The footsteps in the corridor were Ruiz's. She could identify them now, the particular rhythm and weight of them. And they were coming steadily closer, and Dominic stood at the counter with the phone in his hand and his eyes on the kitchen door. And Evelyn stood 6 feet away with her arms at her sides and her jaw set, and her mind already on Asheville, already building the shape of a conversation with a man who had given her name to people who wanted her dead, and thought, You cry when you're done. The kitchen door opened, and Ruiz stepped in and looked at Dominic's face, and in the half-second before anything was said, she watched him understand that the thing he'd been afraid of had arrived, and that there was no version of the next 5 minutes that returned him to where he'd been before he made the choice he'd made, and the understanding of that moved across his face like weather. Ruiz sat down. That was the first thing. That Dominic didn't tell him to sit, didn't gesture at the chair, didn't arrange the room for what was coming. Ruiz walked in and looked at Dominic's face and looked at Evelyn, and then pulled out the chair at the kitchen table and sat down in it, with the slow, deliberate movement of a man who is conserving something, who is deciding how much energy to spend on the performance of normality, and has concluded the answer is very little. Dominic stayed at the counter. He didn't speak right away. He put his phone face down on the counter beside his coffee cup, and he looked at Ruiz, and the silence in the kitchen had a specific density now, a weight that everyone in the room could feel pressing down from the ceiling. Ruiz looked at the table. Then he looked up. How long have you known? He said. Long enough, Dominic said. Ruiz nodded, one small, tight nod, like he was confirming something to himself rather than responding to Dominic. His hands were on the table, both of them, flat, a posture that said, I'm not reaching for anything, I'm not running, I'm here for this. And Evelyn watched his face and saw in it the particular exhaustion of a person who has been carrying a thing they couldn't put down and has finally been relieved of the obligation to pretend otherwise. They have my brother, Ruiz said. Dominic was very still. Marco. He's been in their pocket for 2 years. Gambling debt, original debt, was $40,000. They ran it up to $160 with interest and fees, and then they stopped asking for money and started asking for information. Ruiz's voice was flat and even. He was not asking for anything. He was not performing remorse. He was stating facts in the order they occurred. 6 weeks ago, they picked him up, took him somewhere. They send me a photo every 3 days. Why didn't you come to me? Dominic said. Because they specifically said. Ruiz stopped, started again. They said if I told you, Marco dies. They said they had enough reach inside the organization to know within 12 hours if I talked to you, whether that's true or not. He looked at the table. I couldn't test it with Marco's life. So you gave them the facility location. I gave them a partial, enough to confirm you had her. He glanced at Evelyn. Not enough to breach. I thought I could manage it, give them what they needed to stay quiet about Marco without giving them enough to move against you. And the folder, Evelyn said. Both men looked at her. The folder was left open, she said. That was you. Ruiz looked at her for a moment. They told me to find out how much you knew, how much you could verify from the documents, if you were a viable witness or a complication. He paused. I wanted you to see enough to understand what you were in. I figured if you understood it fully, you'd either run or you'd fight, and either way, it was better than you being managed like cargo. The kitchen was very quiet. Dominic picked up his coffee cup and looked at it and put it down without drinking. Where's Marco now? He said. I don't know. Different location each contact. The photos show him in various interiors, industrial spaces mostly. He's alive. He's not been hurt beyond the initial. Ruiz stopped again. Something crossed his face, brief and controlled and very human, and then was gone. They've been careful with him. He's leverage, not a message. They need him functional. Then he's still functional, Dominic said. And we can find him. Dominic, 9 years, Ruiz. For the first time, something moved under the surface of Dominic's voice. Not anger, not exactly, but the thing that lives underneath anger in people who don't express it easily. The tectonic thing. 9 years and you didn't come to me. They said, I know what they said. He looked at the window. I know what they said, and I know why you believed it. And I know what I would have done in the same position, which is why this conversation is happening in a kitchen instead of somewhere else. He turned back. But we're done with half information. All of it now. Everything they've asked for, everything you've given them, every contact and every drop. Ruiz told him everything. It took 40 minutes. Evelyn sat at the table across from Ruiz and listened and built the architecture of it as he spoke. The contact chain, the dead drop protocol they'd established, the specific requests that had escalated over 6 weeks from location confirmation to document content to personnel schedules. The person Ruiz communicated with was a man he knew only as Strand. No face, no location, burner phone that changed every 72 hours. Strand is Hargrove's operational layer, Dominic said when Ruiz finished. He's been running cleanup for 4 months, he looked at Evelyn, and Travis is in Asheville. Yes, she said, we move in 12 hours. They drove to Asheville in 2 vehicles, leaving before dawn on the 7th day after Hope's birth. Carver stayed with the baby. This was the conversation that cost Evelyn the most. Standing in the room with the crib and looking at her daughter's sleeping face, and understanding that what she was about to do was the opposite of safe, and that safe was not currently an available option. Hope slept through the goodbye. Evelyn stood there longer than she needed to, and then she walked out of the room and down the stairs and got in the car. Dominic rode with her. They didn't talk for the first hour. The roads out of Savannah were still navigating the storm's aftermath. Detours around washed-out sections, the occasional military checkpoint that waved them through without more than a look at the plates. The landscape outside the windows moved from coastal flat to the first gentle rises of the Piedmont, the trees changing character, the sky losing the particular storm-bleached quality of the coast and becoming something bluer and more ordinary. At the 90-minute mark, Dominic said, "Tell me about him." She looked at the road. "Travis?" "What I need to know. Not the marriage, the patterns." She thought about it. He needs to feel like he's in control of a situation before he'll engage with it. If he thinks he's being managed, he shuts down. He gets quiet and formal, and you can't get anything out of him. She paused. But if he thinks he's managing you, if he thinks he has the advantage, he talks. He can't help it. He's been the smartest person in most rooms he's been in, and it made him believe that talking was a form of winning. So we give him the room. I give him the room. You give him nothing, because if he knows you're involved, he'll understand the situation immediately and close down. She looked at Dominic. He can't know you're there until the moment it doesn't matter that he knows. And you can do this? I can do this. He looked at her in the way he sometimes looked at her, the assessing look, the one she'd learned to distinguish from the other kinds of looking he did, the one that was specifically about calibrating what she was capable of and finding, each time, that the calibration needed adjusting upward. You're 8 days postpartum, he said. I know exactly what I am, she said. He turned back to the road. Yeah, he said. You do. Yeah. Travis's mother lived in a neighborhood of comfortable older houses in the north part of Asheville, the kind of neighborhood where the trees were large enough to create a canopy over the street in summer, and where people put considerable flowers in their front gardens and expected them to be respected. Evelyn had been here 4 times in 3 years of marriage. She knew the house, white clapboard, green shutters, a porch with the kind of furniture on it that is meant to suggest a life more leisurely than the one actually lived. Travis's rental car was in the driveway. She'd known it would be. She'd known it with the specific certainty of 11 years of learning a person's patterns until their predictability became a kind of prison for both of you. You knew where they'd go, and they knew you'd know, and you both pretended the knowing wasn't there because the alternative was saying out loud what the knowing meant. She sat in the parked car 2 blocks from the house and looked at her phone and typed, I know where you are. I need to talk. Just me. 1 hour. She sent it. The 3 dots appeared within 40 seconds, disappeared, appeared again. How did you find me? Because I know you, she typed. 1 hour. Your mother's porch. I'm alone. A longer pause this time. Okay. Dominic was in the second vehicle, parked on the cross street with a sightline to the house's east side. She told him everything she knew about the layout. She had an earpiece so small it was essentially invisible, and through it she could hear him breathing, steady, the way it always was. The way she had come to understand was not the absence of tension, but the management of it. I'm going in, she said quietly. I heard, he said in her ear. She got out of the car. Travis answered the porch door before she reached the steps. He looked bad. He'd always been a man who needed sleep and maintenance, who required the infrastructure of a normal life to look like himself, and he'd been without that for a week. His face was gray and unshaved, the skin under his eyes carrying the specific dark weight of a man who has been running through scenarios in his head instead of sleeping. He was wearing a flannel shirt that didn't belong to him. His mother's, probably, from a closet of dead relatives' clothes that the woman kept for reasons Evelyn had never fully understood. He looked at her. Then he looked at her in a different way, taking in the physical reality of her. The changed body, the particular quality of a person who has come through something enormous in the recent past and is still carrying the physical residue of it. The baby, he said. She's healthy. 7 pounds too. Something crossed his face. She'd prepared herself for it to move her and found that it didn't quite, or that it moved her in a direction she hadn't expected, not toward softness, but toward a very clear, very cold understanding of what she was looking at. A man who could feel something for a child he'd never met while being the reason that child's mother had been on a floodwater rooftop alone. Evelyn? Sit down, Travis. He sat. She sat across from him in the porch chair she'd sat in twice before. Family holiday visits, the light through the canopy trees making the same patterns on the porch floor, it had made those other times. Everything else entirely different. I need to know about Coastal Recovery Partners, she said. The color left his face, not gradually, immediately, like a switch, like she'd said a word that was also a physical force. His hands gripped the arms of the chair, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has just understood that the room he thought he was managing has been managed all along. Where did you... I saw the authorizations, your signature, 8 of them. She kept her voice even. The evenness cost her. The routing codes, the amounts, the dates, 6 weeks before Iris made landfall, Travis. 6 weeks. He said nothing. You knew the storm was coming, she said. Not the way everyone knows, specifically, precisely. Someone told you where it was going to hit and when, and you used that information to authorize transfers of money that was supposed to rebuild people's homes. She stopped. I need to know who told you. You need to. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Evelyn, do you understand what you're... Do you know who you're asking about? Yes. If I give you that name, you gave them my name, she said. The porch went silent. A car passed on the street. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and stopped. Travis looked at her. The gray face, the unshaved jaw, the eyes that had always been the things she trusted most about him, and that she now saw were the things she'd been most wrong about. Not because they were cold, but because they were genuinely, helplessly afraid, and a man who is that afraid will do anything to make the fear manageable, and anything included what he'd done. I didn't think they'd... He started. Don't, she said. Evelyn, I was told they just needed to know if you'd seen the documents. That's all. Just confirm or deny. They weren't going to... Travis. She said his name the way Dominic had taught her, without inflection, which was the only way she could say it right now. You gave them my name. I was 9 months pregnant, and you gave them my name, and then you emptied our account and drove north. I don't need you to explain what you intended. I need the name of the federal contact who provided the meteorological data. He looked at her for a long time. In her ear, very quietly, Dominic said nothing. He was there, right? She could hear him breathing, but he gave her the silence, which was the right thing, which she had come to understand was something he was capable of in ways she hadn't expected when this started. Pemberton, Travis said finally. His voice was very low. Richard Pemberton, Deputy Director of the National Emergency Coordination Office. He stopped, swallowed. He's been positioning himself for the FEMA directorship for 3 years. The storm projection data is generated through NECO's modeling program. He had access to Iris's trajectory 14 weeks before the public forecast, and he shared it with Hargrove in exchange for... He stopped again. In exchange for what? She said. Campaign infrastructure. Hargrove has relationships with 6 congressional districts in 3 states. Pemberton wants a Senate seat in 4 years. Hargrove was going to deliver the ground game. Travis pressed his hands against his knees. That's what the money built. Not just the shell companies. The political architecture. Pemberton gets the Senate seat. Hargrove gets a federal appointment in Pemberton's administration. He shook his head. It's bigger than relief fraud. It was always bigger than that. She heard Dominic exhale in her ear, a single, controlled breath. I need proof, she said. Not your word. Documentation. I don't have... Travis. She leaned forward. You have something. You're too careful not to have something. You've been sitting in this house for a week with whatever you kept as insurance, because you're not a stupid man and you've always known that the people you were working with would eventually decide that you were a liability. What do you have? His jaw worked. My mother's car, he said. In the garage. Center console. In her ear. Chen, move to the garage south side. She kept her eyes on Travis. What is it? Copies of 3 emails between Hargrove and Pemberton, dated. The meteorological data is attached to one of them as a PDF. It's time-stamped from NECO's internal system. He looked at his hands. I photographed them on my phone 8 months ago. I told myself it was insurance. I told myself I'd never need it. He laughed, short and humorless. I needed it. She stood up. He looked up at her. What happens now? He said. That's not my decision, she said. She said it to Travis, and she said it to Dominic through the earpiece, and she meant it to both of them in different ways. And then she heard the sound of a vehicle moving fast on the cross street, and a door opening and closing, and footsteps on the path that ran alongside the house. And Travis heard it too, and came out of the chair with the speed of a man who has been waiting for this sound and hoping never to hear it, and stood up and turned toward the porch steps. Dominic came up the steps. He looked at Travis Cole for the first time, and Travis looked at him. And the recognition on Travis's face was instantaneous. The name came first. She could see it arrive, and then the understanding of what the name meant arrived behind it. And what was left on his face after both of them had landed was the specific, complete understanding of a man who has run out of road. Sit down, Dominic said. Travis sat. Chen had the phone. He'd found it in the center console of a 10-year-old Buick in the garage. A secondary phone, prepaid, the photographs transferred to it from Travis's primary device, with the systematic paranoia of a man who'd had 8 months to think about what he'd do when the system he was inside of decided he was expendable. 3 email screenshots, high resolution, clearly legible. The PDF attachment metadata showed a NECO system timestamp of 14 weeks before Iris made landfall. Chen handed the phone to Dominic in the front hallway of the house, while Travis's mother sat in the living room making the deliberate, concentrated act of not listening that people perform when they are listening very hard. And Dominic looked at the screen and then handed it to Evelyn. She looked at it. Pemberton's name was in the header of all 3 emails. The first was logistical, coordinates, timing, the language of people who have done this before and have developed a shorthand for it. The second contained the meteorological data, a PDF marked with NECO's internal classification system. The third was from Pemberton to Hargrove, dated 48 hours before the first transfer authorization that carried Travis's signature. The third email was 4 sentences long. The fourth sentence was, "The window is 11 days from the date of this communication, contingent on Iris maintaining the projected track. Position your instruments accordingly." She handed the phone back. "It's enough," she said. Dominic looked at her. "You're certain?" The timestamp, the classification marking, and the coordination language across 3 emails from a NECO server account constitute documentary evidence of foreknowledge and conspiracy. "Yes, it's enough," he called Vincent. The call was short. Dominic relayed the existence of the photographs, the name, the NECO timestamp, gave instructions for contacting the federal prosecutor who had been designated as the clean channel, the one whose appointment predated Hargrove and Pemberton's arrangement by 3 years and therefore sat outside their architecture. He gave Vincent the location for a data transfer and ended the call. He looked at Travis. "You're going to give a full statement," he said. "Tonight. Everything. The transfers, the contact chain, Hargrove, Pemberton, all of it. You're going to give it to the federal prosecutor's office, and you're going to do it completely, because the only version of the next several years that doesn't end badly for you is the one where you are unambiguously and fully cooperative." He paused. "Do you understand that?" Travis looked at Evelyn. Not at Dominic, at her. She looked back at him and said nothing. There was nothing to say to that look, to the specific quality of appeal in it, to the particular shape of a man hoping for something from a person they have spent all their credit with and know it and are hoping for it anyway. She had nothing left to spend on it, and she was not going to perform a spending she didn't have. "Yes," Travis said, to Dominic. "I understand." The federal prosecutor's name was Aldridge, and she met them at a secure location 90 minutes from Asheville with 2 agents Dominic's people had vetted independently, and a court reporter and the kind of face that suggested she had been working toward this conversation for some time and was not going to waste it. Travis talked for 4 hours. Evelyn was not in the room for the statement. She sat in an anteroom with a cup of coffee that went cold and looked at her phone and thought about Hope in the crib in the house in Savannah, about the rise and fall of the small chest, the fast, strong heartbeat she'd felt against her sternum on the morning her daughter arrived. She thought about it the way you think about a fixed point when everything around it is moving. Dominic came in at the 2-hour mark and sat in the chair across from her. He looked exhausted in a way she hadn't seen from him before. Not the operational exhaustion of a man who hasn't slept, but something deeper, the specific depletion that comes from a place beyond tired, from a place where the thing you've been carrying finally touches ground, and you feel the full weight of it for the first time because you're no longer moving fast enough to stay ahead of it. He didn't say anything for a while. She said, "Ruiz's brother. Chen has a team looking. He'll find him?" "Yes." He said it with the flatness of a man who means it as a statement of fact rather than reassurance. "We'll find him." She looked at the cold coffee. "What happens after tonight?" Aldridge moves for emergency warrants. Hargrove, Pemberton, 6 subordinates. The shell companies get frozen within 48 hours. He leaned forward in the chair, forearms on his knees. The same posture he'd used at her bedside in the recovery room, she noticed. the posture of a man making himself smaller in a room when he doesn't need to be. The federal investigation takes over the case. Our documentation goes into their chain of evidence. And Strand, Hargrove's cleanup operation. Strand is the piece I don't have yet. His jaw tightened. He knows Aldridge's office is moving. He'll know within hours of the warrants, if not before. He'll execute whatever final directive Hargrove has in place before his access collapses. She looked at him. The warehouse, she said. You said weeks ago you had investigators working out of a waterfront location, building the evidence transfer protocol. Yes. If Strand knows the case is moving tonight, Dominic was already on his feet. His phone was at his ear before she finished the sentence, and she could hear it from across the room. The call going through, the voice on the other end, the specific 3-second pause before Dominic said, "Get out. Get everyone out now." And the quality of the response. The quality of 3 seconds of silence that told her the answer before Dominic's face confirmed it. He lowered the phone. "They're already there," he said. The warehouse was 40 minutes from Asheville by the route they took. Dominic driving, Evelyn in the passenger seat because she had refused to be left in the anteroom and had simply gotten in the car, and he had looked at her once and started the engine. 2 of Chen's people in the vehicle behind them. Ruiz who was still with them. Ruiz who had told Dominic everything in a kitchen that morning and was still, somehow, in the car, riding in the back. The rain started at the 30-minute mark. Not Iris. Iris was long gone, spent, but a new system moving in from the west. The ordinary rain of a Carolinas autumn that had no drama behind it, that just fell and kept falling with the indifference of weather that doesn't know what's happening beneath it. Dominic drove without speaking, and Evelyn watched the road and felt her heartbeat in her chest, in her throat, and her temples. Felt it the way you feel it when your body is committed to something and is running ahead of the decision you made to do it. Through the rain, ahead of them, the waterfront district materialized out of the dark. The low industrial silhouette of the warehouses, the cranes along the dock, the black water of the harbor beyond. And above one of the structures, the specific orange light of something burning. Dominic pressed the accelerator and said, in a voice that was very quiet and absolutely level, "There are people in that building." She could see it now. The warehouse, a 3-story steel and concrete structure at the end of the wharf, with light coming from the windows on the second floor, that was not the ordinary light of a working interior, but the moving, climbing light of a fire that has found fuel and is making decisions about where to go next. She could see 2 vehicles parked at angles near the loading bay that were not the vehicles that should have been there. Dominic's phone rang. He took the call on speaker. Chen's voice. "2 of our people confirmed out. Malik and Torres. Garza's unaccounted for. The servers are still inside." "The servers have the chain of evidence," Dominic said. "Strand's people are inside the building," Chen said. "At least 4. They're not burning it down because they finished in there. They started the fire and they're still inside, which means they haven't got what they came for yet." "Garza has the access protocol," Dominic said. Not to Chen, to himself, or to the windshield, or to the particular geometry of a situation that had just become something else. Without the protocol, the servers are encrypted. Strand's people can't extract the data. "Which means Garza is still alive," Evelyn said. Dominic looked at her. "They need him to open the servers," she said. "They haven't killed him because they can't get what they came for without him. The fire is pressure. It's a clock, not an ending." She felt her heartbeat in her teeth. "How long before the structure is compromised?" Dominic put the car in park at the edge of the warehouse approach, and looked at the building, and looked at the orange light climbing in the second-floor windows, and looked at the 2 vehicles by the loading bay and said, in a voice that was the same as it always was, and that she now understood was not the absence of feeling, but its extreme compression, "Not long enough." He got out of the car. She got out of the car. He turned and looked at her across the roof of the vehicle in the rain and the orange light, and said, "Evelyn?" "Garza," she said. "Second floor. I know field triage. If he's been worked over, you need someone who knows what they're doing." She held his gaze across the car roof in the rain. "And you need both hands." He looked at her for 1 second. 2. Then he said to Ruiz without taking his eyes off her, "Stay on her. And he moved toward the building, and she moved behind him, and Ruiz moved behind her, and the rain came down over the burning warehouse, and the harbor water and the dark sky, and everything that had been set in motion 8 days ago on a rooftop in a flooded city was contracting now toward this moment, toward this building, toward the servers inside it that held the evidence of $40 million stolen from people who had lost everything else, and the man who was walking ahead of her into the heat and the smoke, and the narrowing geometry of a situation with very specific and non-negotiable stakes was the same man who had come down a wire in a hurricane for reasons that had never been entirely simple, and she was following him into a burning building 8 days after giving birth. Because the alternative was to let the thing they'd built together in those 8 days become nothing, become smoke, become the kind of ending where the people who had planned the disaster also got to profit from the cleanup, and nobody ever proved otherwise. She went in. The smoke hit her face like a wall, hot and particulate, the specific quality of burning synthetic materials, the kind of smoke that is immediately and seriously wrong to breathe. She pulled the collar of her jacket up over her nose and followed Dominic through the loading bay and up the interior stairs and into the second floor where the heat was a different thing entirely. Not the ambient warmth of a building that has caught fire somewhere else, but the immediate directional heat of a fire that is in the room with you, that has taken up residence in the northeast corner and is working its way along the wall with the methodical, unhurried progress of something that has all the time in the world. The second floor was open plan, a working space that had been converted for Dominic's investigators. Long tables with equipment, filing systems along the walls. The server rack visible at the far end of the room behind a glass partition that had cracked in the heat, but not yet given way. The smoke was dense enough at ceiling height to be a second ceiling, pressing down, reducing the breathable space to the lower 4 feet of the room. They moved low. Dominic ahead, Evelyn behind him, Ruiz behind her, all three of them crouching below the smoke line, moving along the floor in the specific way that fire training teaches, and that the body learns differently when the fire is real and the training was abstract. The difference between knowing and doing. Evelyn had done fire drills at the hospital every 18 months for 11 years, and none of them had felt like this. Like the heat on the back of her neck was a hand pressing down, like the smoke at the edge of her vision was a clock running. She heard voices before she saw anyone. 3 of them, male, terse, the clipped communication of men working under pressure, coming from the direction of the server partition. She touched Dominic's shoulder, and he stopped and they listened. "Give us the sequence and we walk out." A sound that was not a voice, that was a person making a sound that was not voluntary, the compressed, involuntary output of someone in significant pain trying not to give the people causing the pain the satisfaction of the full expression of it. Garza. Dominic moved. He moved fast and low, and with the absolute economy of a man who has made the decision before his body executes it, who has collapsed the gap between intention and action to the point where they are essentially simultaneous, and Evelyn moved behind him, because the alternative was to stop, and she had decided some time ago in this building and before this building that she was not stopping. The glass partition had a door. Dominic went through it low and fast, and the first man inside the partition turned toward the sound, and Dominic hit him with his shoulder at mid-body height, and they went into the server rack together, the rack taking the impact with a sound of stressed metal, and the man going down and staying there. The second man had a weapon. He had it up before Dominic fully straightened, and there was a half-second choke. She saw it, saw the specific geometry of the room and the positions in it, and the half-second in which everything was in suspension. And then Ruiz, coming through the door behind Dominic, hit the man's gun arm from the side with both hands, a hard lateral push that redirected the weapon, and the shot that fired went into the server partition wall and not into Dominic, and the sound of it in the enclosed space was enormous and immediate and left a ringing in Evelyn's ears that didn't go away. The third man was already moving for the door. He ran directly into Evelyn. She was not a large person, and he was. Broad, fast, moving with the committed velocity of someone whose only remaining plan is away from here. And the collision was not elegant. She went into the doorframe with her left shoulder and felt it as a white flash of pain that radiated down her arm and into her hand, and she grabbed at him as she went, grabbed the back of his jacket, and it wasn't enough to stop him, but it was enough to slow him. And Ruiz was there. Ruiz had cleared the second man and was there. And the third man went down in the doorway with Ruiz on top of him, and the sound of a struggle that lasted approximately 4 seconds before it stopped. Evelyn straightened up against the door frame. Her left arm was wrong, not broken. She ran the assessment automatically. The clinical inventory she'd spent 11 years developing for other people's bodies and was now running on her own. But the shoulder had taken the impact badly and was sending up strong, continuous objections, and she was going to have to manage those objections because the room was still on fire, and there was still a man on the floor in the server partition who needed attention. Garza was in a chair. He'd been secured to it, zip ties at the wrists, which she could see had been there long enough to cut into the skin, and he was conscious, barely, his head up and his eyes tracking when she came to him, which told her the most important thing. His face had been worked over, a systematic job, not frenzied, the kind of damage that is inflicted by people who know how to calibrate it to produce maximum compliance without producing unconsciousness, because an unconscious person can't give you an access protocol. His right eye was swollen shut, his lip had been split and had bled down his chin and onto the front of his shirt, and the blood had dried, which meant this had been going on for a while. She was beside him before she consciously registered moving. "Garza," she said, "I'm Evelyn. I'm a nurse. Can you tell me your name?" "Miguel," he said. His voice was thick. "Miguel Garza." "Miguel, are you having any trouble breathing?" "No. My ribs." He stopped. "Left side." She put her hand on his left side gently, feeling through the shirt. He made the compressed involuntary sound again. 2 ribs, at minimum. Possibly more. "I know," she said. "I need you to breathe for me. Steady, through the nose, don't stop. The ribs will hurt, but they won't stop you. You understand?" "Yeah," he said. "Good." She looked at his wrists. "I need something to cut these." Dominic was beside her. She hadn't heard him move. He had a folding knife open. She registered this without comment, filed it in the category of things she was assembling about him that she would think about later when there was a later. And he cut the ties at Garza's wrists in 2 motions, and Garza brought his hands to the front of him and looked at the marks on his wrists, and then looked at Dominic. "The servers," Garza said. "Still up," Dominic said. "You have the protocol?" Garza looked at the server rack through the cracked glass. The fire in the northeast corner had reached the wall adjacent to the partition, and Evelyn could feel the heat of it on her right side, could smell the paint on the wall beginning to blister. They had minutes. She didn't know exactly how many. "I have it," Garza said. He tried to stand and couldn't, his legs giving in a way that his face told her embarrassed him more than the pain did. She got her right arm under his, and Dominic got his left, and they got him up, and he stood between them with his weight distributed between 2 people and his eyes on the server rack. "Remote," he said. The transfer was supposed to be remote. The protocol uploads the encrypted package to Aldridge's secure server directly. It doesn't... "Can you do it from here?" Dominic said. "If the terminal's still responding." They moved him to the terminal at the end of the server rack. The keyboard was warm to the touch. She felt it when she put her hand on the housing to steady Garza. Warm in a way that was not the warmth of running equipment, but the warmth of a room that was getting hotter by the minute. Garza's fingers found the keyboard with the practiced ease of someone who has done this in normal conditions many times. And she watched his hands, the cut wrists, the swollen knuckles, the dried blood, move across the keys with a precision that told her something about the kind of person he was. The kind of person who performed under damage because the damage didn't change what needed doing. He typed a sequence, 12 characters, then a second sequence. Then he hit enter, and they waited. The progress bar that appeared on the screen was the most ordinary-looking thing Evelyn had seen in the last 8 days. A simple horizontal bar, blue against gray, with a percentage that climbed from 0 in the way that progress bars always did. Too fast at first and then slower, the optimism of the first 30% giving way to the real pace of the thing. The fire found the exterior wall of the partition. It didn't burst through. It arrived, the way fire arrives when it's been working towards something, with a specific quality of intention that is entirely mindless and entirely merciless, orange light pressing through a seam in the wall at ceiling height and beginning to work downward. Dominic looked at the progress bar. He looked at the wall. He looked at Evelyn. 60%, she said. She was watching the screen. The floor above us is steel decking, he said. When the fire reaches the supporting column on the north wall, I know what happens, she said. Evelyn. 68%, she said. I know what happens, and I'm telling you we have time. You don't know that. No, she said. I don't. 72. He stood beside her and looked at the screen, and she felt his presence beside her. The specific mass and heat of a man who is processing a situation in which he has limited control and is doing it without externally visible distress. And she focused on the screen and on keeping Garza upright and on breathing the increasingly compromised air in the room without inhaling the particulates that would cause the most damage. And she thought about Hope in the crib in the house in Savannah with a completely different quality of thought than she'd had access to in a long time. Not the anxious thought of a person cataloging what they stand to lose, but the steady thought of a person who knows what they're doing this for and has made the calculation and found it still valid. 78. The column on the north wall made a sound. It was a low sound, lower than she expected, almost subsonic, felt in the chest as much as heard, and the floor beneath them shifted by a fraction that was small and significant, and she felt Garza grab the server rack housing for balance, and she felt Dominic's hand close on her arm, not pulling, just present. 84. The column's going, Ruiz said from the doorway. He'd gotten the 3 men secured. She didn't know how, had stopped tracking the periphery, and was standing at the partition door with his eyes on the ceiling. 60 seconds. Maybe 89. Dominic, Ruiz said. I see it, Dominic said. 93. The column sound again, longer this time, a sustained, low-frequency complaint from a structural member that had been built to hold a specific load under specific conditions, and was now being asked to hold it while those conditions changed around it in ways that nothing is engineered to accommodate. 97. The ceiling in the northeast corner dropped 4 inches. Not catastrophically, not yet, but perceptibly, visibly, with the deliberate quality of something giving way incrementally before it gives way all at once. 98. 99. The screen changed. Transfer complete. Package received. Aldridge Secure Server. Confirmed. One word appeared beneath it. Green text, small font, absolutely unambiguous. Delivered. Dominic said, Go. And Evelyn already was. Already moving, already getting Garza's arm over her shoulders, already heading for the door with the specific velocity of a person who has been holding themselves at the edge of this moment and can now finally commit to the next one. Ruiz took Garza's other side, and they went through the partition door and across the main floor. And the floor was hotter now, and the smoke had dropped another foot toward the ground, and she was fully crouched, moving, feeling the heat on the back of her neck with an intimacy that she would remember later in the particular way you remember things that happen to your skin. The stairs. Dominic leading, Ruiz and Evelyn with Garza between them. The loading bay. The outside air. The outside air was cold and wet, and she had never in her life understood the specific value of cold and wet air until she breathed it in through her mouth and felt it go all the way down, felt the relief of it in her lungs that was physical and total, and for 1 second was the only thing she was aware of. Then the north wall of the warehouse made its final decision. The sound was enormous. Not an explosion, but a collapse, the deep structural surrender of steel and concrete. The building's upper section coming down into itself with a compressed, reverberating thunder that she felt in her sternum and her back teeth and the soles of her feet through the wet ground. A pressure wave of displaced air and particulate hit them. She turned her face away from it, felt it against the back of her neck and her left shoulder, felt Ruiz pulling Garza further from the structure. When she turned back, the north end of the warehouse was inside itself. Steam and smoke rising where the fire and the rain met. She stood in the rain and looked at it. She became aware that her left shoulder was sending up demands for attention that were no longer possible to defer. She became aware that she was shaking, not fear, or not only fear, but the specific physical aftermath of sustained adrenaline. The body's accounting department presenting the bill for what the last 40 minutes had cost. She put her right hand on the shaking left arm and held it and breathed and looked at the collapsed building and at Dominic standing 6 feet away looking at the same thing. His face in the firelight and the rain was the same as it always was, and she understood now that this was not armor, not the careful construction of a man protecting something, but simply the face of someone who had been through enough that the face had become a document of endurance rather than a performance of it. The scar along his jaw was white in the light. His hands were at his sides, steady. He turned and looked at her. She looked back at him. Garza coughed behind her, a deep, productive cough, the lungs clearing themselves, and somewhere in the distance the sound of sirens was building, multiple units, the response that had been called the moment Chen's people confirmed the fire, and those sirens were going to arrive, and with them would come a different phase of this thing, the phase that belonged to federal prosecutors, and evidence chains, and the slow institutional machinery of accountability that ground forward with or without urgency. But they were not there yet. Right now there was the rain and the firelight and the collapsed building and the servers whose contents were already on Aldridge's secure server being processed by people who would spend the next 72 hours reading the architecture of what Richard Pemberton and Warren Hargrove had built around a storm they'd watched coming and decided to use. Dominic said, "You're hurt." "Yes," she said. "Your shoulder." "Yes." He crossed the distance between them and put his hand on her right arm. The good arm, the one that wasn't sending up distress signals, and held it in a way that was not tentative and not possessive but simply present. The grip of a man who is establishing a connection because the alternative is no connection and he has decided against the alternative. She looked at him. He looked at her. The sirens were close now. She could see the lights, blue and red, painting the rain and the smoke and the wet ground in alternating colors. And there was so much still ahead of them. Travis in his statement, and Aldridge and the warrants and Ruiz's brother and everything that the morning was going to bring when the institutional machinery started moving and all the things Dominic had built and all the things she had been dragged into and had chosen to stay inside of came to their reckoning. She looked at the lights coming through the rain and said quietly, not to him but also to him, "It delivered." "Yes," he said, "Pemberton's name is on Aldridge's server right now." "Yes." She breathed, the cold air, the rain on her face. "Then it's almost done," she said. He looked at her with the dark eyes that had given her just enough across 8 days and had held back the rest, and the rest was still there. She could see it, had been learning to see it, was only beginning to understand the full inventory of what it contained. And he said, very quietly, the words barely audible under the rain and the approaching sirens and the last sounds of the building settling into itself. "Not yet," he said. The first emergency vehicle turned onto the wharf approach, its lights sweeping across the warehouse ruins and the wet ground and the 4 people standing in the rain, and in the white-blue flash of it, she saw his face clearly for a full second. The broken jaw, the scar, the eyes that were looking at her with something that had been building for 8 days and had no clean name yet. And she held that image in the strobe light of the arriving world and thought, "We are not done. Not yet. But we are very close to something." The first officer out of the lead vehicle was a federal agent named Cross. She learned his name later, learned it the way you learn the names of people who arrive at the worst moments and become forever associated with the specific quality of those moments. He was tall, mid-40s, with the deliberate movements of someone trained to assess before acting. And he assessed the scene in front of him, the burning warehouse, the 4 people standing in the rain, one of them visibly injured, one of them Dominic DeLuca, with the compressed professional calm of a man who had been briefed and was now confirming the briefing against reality. He confirmed it quickly. "Aldridge is 20 minutes out," he said to Dominic. Not a greeting, a logistics update between people who had been operating in parallel and were now converging. "She wants everyone on site when she arrives." "Garza needs a hospital," Dominic said. "Ambulance is behind us." Cross looked at Evelyn. "Ma'am, are you—" "I'm fine," she said. She was not entirely fine. Her left shoulder had settled into a deep, continuous ache that radiated up into her neck and down into her elbow, and she was aware of it the way you are aware of something you have decided to address later, which is to say constantly and at a remove. "I'm a nurse. I know what I am." Cross looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man filing something for later use. The ambulance arrived and Garza went with it. He argued, briefly, with the specific stubbornness of a man who has been through something and feels that leaving is a form of abandonment. And Dominic said, "Miguel, go," with a flatness that ended the argument, and Garza went. Ruiz stood apart from the others. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and he was looking at the collapsed warehouse, and his face had the quality of a man doing an accounting that has no good outcome, running the numbers on what he'd given and what it had cost, and what the final balance looked like. Evelyn watched him from across the wet ground and thought about what he'd said in the kitchen. "I couldn't test it with Marco's life." She thought about what that sentence contained, what it required of a person to say it cleanly and without performance. And she thought that Ruiz was a more complicated man than she'd understood when she first identified him, and a more decent one than the thing he'd done would suggest, and that those two things were not contradictory and never had been. She walked over to him. He looked up when she approached. "Chen's people are looking for Marco," she said. "I know." Dominic said they'll find him. Ruiz looked at her. "He says things like that," he said, "and he means them. That's the—" He stopped, looked at the warehouse. "That's the part that makes it hard. The fact that he means it." She stood beside him in the rain and didn't say anything else because there wasn't anything else to say that would improve on the silence. Aldridge arrived in 23 minutes, not 20, and she arrived the way Evelyn imagined she arrived everywhere. Already in motion, already 3 steps into the conversation before the car door was fully open. She was a compact woman in her early 50s with short gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the look of someone who slept 5 hours a night and had made peace with that as a lifestyle. She had 2 agents with her and a laptop and a courier bag that she did not put down for the entirety of the conversation that followed. She sat up in the back of one of the federal vehicles, and she talked to Dominic first, alone, for 18 minutes by Evelyn's count. Then she talked to Ruiz for 11. Then she came and found Evelyn sitting on the running board of Chen's vehicle with her right hand pressed against her left shoulder and her face turned up into the rain that was finally, after 3 hours, beginning to ease. Aldridge stood in front of her and looked at her the way she'd looked at the warehouse site, assessing, confirming. "Your heart," she said. "Yes." "You authenticated the transfer authorizations." "Yes." "And you identified Travis Cole's location and facilitated his cooperation." "He cooperated because he was out of options," Evelyn said. "I just told him what his options were." Aldridge almost smiled. It didn't quite get there, but the direction of it was clear. She sat down on the running board beside Evelyn, which was not what Evelyn expected, the sitting down, the deliberate placement of herself at the same level, and opened the laptop and angled it so they could both see the screen. "The transfer delivered clean," Aldridge said. "Full package. The Pemberton emails with the NECO timestamp are already in front of a federal judge in D.C. The warrant request went up 40 minutes ago." She paused. "By morning, Richard Pemberton will not be the deputy director of anything." Evelyn looked at the screen. The evidence chain laid out in the precise documentary language of federal law enforcement, case numbers, exhibit labels, chain of custody notations. Travis's name appeared in 3 places. Her own name appeared in 1 under the heading Cooperating Witness, Authentication. She looked at her name in that document. Cooperating Witness. She thought about the woman who had stood in the kitchen of the house on Magnolia Creek Drive 9 days ago, with the savings account at 0 and the water rising in the front yard. And she thought about the distance between that woman and the one sitting on a running board in the rain outside a collapsed warehouse with her name in a federal evidence chain. And she thought that the distance was not as large as it should have been, that the path between those 2 points had been more direct than it had any right to be. "What happens to Travis?" she said. "Full cooperation agreement. He testifies, he does time, reduced, but real. The cooperation doesn't buy him out. It buys him a number he can survive." Aldridge looked at her. "Is that—" "Yes," Evelyn said. "That's fine." "You don't want to discuss it?" "No." She looked at the rain. "I know what he did. I know what the cooperation means. I'm not—" She stopped, started differently. "He's the father of my daughter. That's a thing that exists regardless of everything else. I'm not asking for anything more than what the law says he deserves. And I'm not asking for anything less. Aldridge looked at her for a moment. All right, she said. What about Strand? Evelyn said. Hargrove's operational layer. A pause. We have a name. We have a location as of 6 hours ago. Cross is running the pickup. She closed the laptop. By morning. By morning. She was beginning to understand that phrase as a kind of unit of measurement specific to this world. The world of federal warrants and evidence chains, and the slow, grinding machinery of institutional accountability. By morning meant the acute phase is over, the chronic phase is beginning, and the chronic phase is the one that actually decides what the whole thing meant. And Hargrove himself, she said. Warrant is signed, Aldridge said. He's in custody as of... She checked her phone. 40 minutes ago, he was at his home in Columbia. He didn't run. She said this with a faint quality of surprise. Some of them don't. They can't believe it's actually happening until it's already happened. Evelyn thought about that, about the specific psychology of a man who had designed a mechanism around a hurricane, who had looked at the projected path of a storm and seen an architecture of profit in it, who had organized the theft of $40 million from people who had lost their homes and their vehicles and their accumulated lives to wind and water, and who had then, at the end of it, simply sat in his house and waited because he couldn't believe that the thing he'd built could come apart. She didn't feel satisfaction, exactly. She felt the absence of something, the specific negative space left by a weight you've been carrying that has finally been set down. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like the room after a long argument, quiet in a way that is different from peace, but is the first condition required for peace to become possible. Dominic drove her back to the house. Just the two of them. Chen took the other vehicle. Ruiz went with Cross for a follow-up conversation that was not quite a debrief and not quite something more consequential, and that Dominic had arranged with a quiet word to Aldridge that Evelyn had observed and understood. Ruiz would be all right. Not unchanged, not exempt from consequence, but all right. She understood that Dominic had spent a credit he valued to ensure it and had done so without announcing the expenditure, which was the only way he knew how to spend things that cost him. The rain had stopped by the time they reached the car. The sky to the east, over the harbor and the Atlantic beyond it, had the first pale suggestion of what would eventually be dawn. Not light yet, but the beginning of the absence of dark, the sky making a tentative commitment to the idea of morning. They drove for a while without speaking. She was aware of her shoulder, of the particular exhaustion that comes from a body that has been asked to do too much for too many days consecutively and has complied and is now submitting its invoice in the form of every deferred ache and every postponed tremor arriving at once. She was aware of Dominic beside her in the way she had become aware of him across 9 days. As a specific presence, a specific weight and warmth and quality of aliveness that occupied space in a way she had learned to read without consciously learning it. Your shoulder needs imaging, he said. I know. Tonight. Tomorrow, she said. I want to see Hope first. He didn't argue. She had noticed that about him, that he did not argue about things he understood were not arguments. He had a precise instinct for the difference between a negotiation and a statement of fact, and he treated them accordingly. Carver will be awake, he said. Good. They drove. After a while, she said, The journal. He looked at her briefly, back to the road. What journal? Vincent mentioned something weeks ago. I've been thinking about it. He said your father had a record, old records, personal ones. He said some of what's happened has history behind it. She paused. I don't know the exact words, but I've been thinking about why you were in Savannah when the storm hit. You were running an investigation that had been active for 6 months. The investigation started in Savannah specifically. She looked at him. Not because Hargrove is a South Carolina appointment. You could have run this from Atlanta or D.C. You were in Savannah specifically. He was quiet for a moment. My father grew up there, he said. He left when he was 22. He never went back while he was alive. A pause. He talked about it. Certain streets, certain neighborhoods, the way the city smelled in August. He talked about it the way people talk about places they left before they were finished with them. She waited. He died 3 years ago, Dominic said. Going through his things, there was a journal. He kept it inconsistently, years between some entries. It was mostly logistical. Notes on people, on debts paid and owed, on the kind of transactions that don't get documented anywhere else. He stopped. There was one entry about a flood, 1989. He'd been in Savannah for a meeting and a storm came through. Not a major storm, nothing like Iris, but the drainage failed and a section of the old waterfront district flooded. He went into the water for reasons the journal doesn't make entirely clear, got turned around. Would have drowned. He paused. A woman pulled him out. He wrote about her for 3 pages, which was unlike him. He was not a man who wrote 3 pages about anything. He described her in specific detail. What she looked like, the way she moved, the fact that she refused any acknowledgement and was gone before he could get her name. The road ahead was empty and dark, and the first gray light was finding the edges of things. There was a photograph, Dominic said, tucked into the back of the journal. He must have gotten someone to take it without her seeing, or found it afterward. I don't know the mechanics of it. Just a photograph. Woman in her early 30s, pale green eyes, standing on a wet street. Evelyn felt the air in the car change. He wrote her description in the journal, Dominic said, and under the description, he wrote one line. I memorized it because it was the most personal thing I ever read in anything he left behind. He was quiet for a moment. He wrote, "Some debts cannot be paid to the person who is owed. They must be paid forward to whoever comes next." The car was very quiet. Outside, the sky was definitively beginning. Not dawn yet, but its announcement, a gray pink at the eastern edge that had the quality of a door opening slowly in a dark room. "My mother," Evelyn said. "Lillian Hart," he said. "Yes." She looked at the road. She looked at her hands in her lap, the right one resting over the left, covering the shoulder she couldn't move without pain. She thought about her mother at 63, the stroke that came without warning, the hospital room, the pale green eyes that were the same as her own looking at her one last time. The good ones always find each other, Evie. Don't you give up before they get there. She had spent 4 years not entirely understanding what that meant. "You knew," she said. Not an accusation, a statement of a fact she was assembling in real time. "When you found my name on Hargrove's list. When you cross-referenced Travis's connections. You found my name and you found out who I was and you looked up who Lillian Hart was." "Yes," he said. "And then the storm hit and I was on a roof." "Yes." "And the debt," she said. "It wasn't only the debt," he said. He said it with the flatness of someone saying a difficult thing in the simplest available way, because the simple way is the honest way, and honesty at this particular moment is the only currency that has any value. "The debt was the reason I was looking. What I found when I looked," he stopped. "That was something else." She sat with that for a long time. She sat with it the way she sat with things she needed to process correctly rather than quickly, letting it settle, letting it find its level, not responding to it until she understood the shape of it. Then she said, "You should have told me, from the beginning." "Yes," he said. "I should have." "Why didn't you?" "Because I didn't know what it would mean to you. Whether it would seem, he paused. "Whether you'd understand it as a reason or as a transaction. Whether it would make what happened on that roof feel like something other than what it was." "What was it?" she said. "I came off that helicopter because you were there," he said. "The journal was why I was looking. It wasn't why I went down the wire." She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road and she looked at the side of his face. The jaw, the scar, the dark eyes she could see from this angle. And she thought about the wire in the hurricane, the absolute steadiness of the descent, the arm around her on the way up that was about function and also about something more than function. And she thought about 9 days of a man who said what was true and withheld what wasn't ready to be said, and who had, she was beginning to understand, been making that distinction with a care that was its own kind of statement. She said, "Thank you for telling me." He nodded. One small, tight nod. The same nod she'd seen from him across 9 days when he'd confirmed something he'd already decided and was moving past it. The nod of a man who considers something settled when it's been said. They drove the rest of the way in silence that was a different quality from all the previous silences. It was the silence of people who have said the thing and are now living in the space after it. Hope was awake. She was awake and making her opinions known about it in the full-throated, indignant register she had apparently decided was her preferred mode of communication, and the sound of her reached Evelyn at the foot of the stairs before she had cleared the front door. Carver appeared at the top of the stairs with the baby against her shoulder, patting her back with the rhythmic competence of a woman who had been doing this since the small hours. And when she saw Evelyn, she said nothing, just came down the stairs and transferred Hope into Evelyn's good arm with the clean efficiency of a handoff between professionals. Hope stopped crying immediately. Not gradually. Immediately, the way a switch changes state. One moment noise, and the next moment a small face against Evelyn's neck, and warm weight settling into her chest, and the particular smell of her daughter that Evelyn had already memorized in 9 days as thoroughly as she had memorized anything in her life. She stood in the hallway and held her daughter and felt the accumulated weight of the last 9 hours. The porch in Asheville, the warehouse, the rain, the collapse, Aldridge's laptop, the drive home, settle through her body and into the floor beneath her feet, and she breathed, once, fully, all the way down. Carver looked at her shoulder. "You need imaging." "Tomorrow," Evelyn said. "Today," Carver said. "It's already today." It was. The windows were gray with early morning. The birds, she could hear them beginning, the specific first tentative offerings of birds that start before the light is fully committed, before the day is certain, were doing what birds did at this hour, which was decide one by one that the night was over. Dominic had stopped in the doorway behind her. She turned, still holding Hope, and looked at him standing at the threshold. The same threshold pause she had been observing since the recovery room, the same instinct to stop at the boundary of spaces he hadn't been invited into. She had thought, early on, that it was a habit of command, the unconscious positioning of a man who was accustomed to being the one who decided when he entered a room. She understood now that it was something else, a form of restraint, a deliberately maintained awareness of what was his and what was not. She said, "Come in." He came in. Siam. 3 weeks later, Warren Hargrove entered a federal courthouse in Columbia, South Carolina, in handcuffs. Evelyn watched it on the news on Carver's laptop. She didn't have her own yet, was still in the process of rebuilding the material infrastructure of a life that Travis had stripped to zero before he drove north, a process that was slower and more tedious and more intermittently enraging than she'd expected. The news footage showed Hargrove in a gray suit, his face carrying the specific quality of a man who has spent 30 years believing in his own insulation and is now experiencing the systematic removal of it. He did not look at the cameras. He kept his eyes on the courthouse steps as though counting them was a task that required his full attention. Richard Pemberton had resigned his federal position 8 days after the warrants were issued, issuing a statement through his attorney that used the word inappropriate 4 times and the word regret twice, and did not, at any point, contain the word sorry. The federal charges against him were filed 6 days after the resignation. His Senate ambitions, which had been the engine of the entire mechanism, were not mentioned in the charges but were effectively present in every line of them. Strand, whose real name turned out to be Gerald Forsyth, 47, a former private contractor with a career history that Evelyn did not read in its entirety because she could identify the shape of it from the first 3 paragraphs, was arrested in a motel in Myrtle Beach by Cross's team on the morning after the warehouse fire. He had been in the process of destroying a laptop when they came through the door. The laptop, partially destroyed, yielded enough. Travis's cooperation agreement was finalized on a Tuesday. He called Evelyn from a number she didn't recognize. A supervised call, she understood, the kind of call that happens under specific conditions with specific limitations. He said her name when she answered, and then he didn't say anything for a moment, and she waited. "She's healthy?" he said. "Yes." "What does she look like?" She thought about that, about what the honest answer was, and whether Travis Cole had the right to the honest answer, and what it cost her to give it or withhold it. She thought about Hope's face in the morning light, the way she looked at things. with a quality of focused attention that seemed too old for a person 3 weeks into existence, that seemed to be gathering information about the world with the seriousness of someone who had plans for it. "She has your nose," Evelyn said, "and my eyes." A silence. "I'm sorry," he said. He said it with the flatness of a man who knows the words are insufficient and is saying them anyway because they're all he has. "I know that, Travis," she said. "Yeah. Be her father," she said. "Whatever that looks like from where you're going to be for the next several years, be it. Write to her, learn what she can do each month, and respond to it. Don't disappear." She paused. "That's what I need from you, not the apology. The thing after the apology." A long silence. "Okay," he said. "Yeah, okay." She ended the call and stood in the kitchen of the house that was not her house. She would need to find her own house, was already beginning that process, was building the list of things she needed to build from the rubble of the life Travis had stripped when he drove north, and looked at the morning through the window and felt the specific clarity that comes after a thing is said that cannot be unsaid, and found that the clarity was clean. Ruiz's brother was found on the 16th day. Marco Ruiz, 34, was found in an industrial storage unit in North Charleston, alive, dehydrated, with a broken wrist, and the specific psychological quality of a person who has been held in a small space for an extended period and is not yet sure the holding is over. Chen's people brought him out. Dominic arranged the medical care and arranged, through channels that Evelyn did not ask about and did not need to, for the people who had been responsible for the storage unit to be in federal custody before the week was out. Ruiz came to the house the day after Marco was found. He knocked on the door in the morning, and when Evelyn opened it, he was standing on the step with his hands in his pockets and the specific look of a man who has rehearsed what he's going to say and has discarded the rehearsal and is now standing in front of it without a script. "I wanted you to know," he said, "what I did, giving them the location. I know what it cost." He looked at her. "I don't expect—" "You don't have to do this," she said. "I want to." She looked at him, at the flat, watchful eyes that had a different quality now than they'd had 3 weeks ago. Not softer exactly, but more present, more willing to be in the room with what they were looking at. "Your brother is home," she said. "Yes." "Then it cost what it cost, and the balance is what it is." She paused. "Don't explain yourself to me. Explain yourself to Dominic." "I did," he said. "He explained himself back. He stopped. "That's who he is." "I know," she said. She did know. She was accumulating the knowledge of it the way you accumulate the knowledge of a person you are choosing to look at clearly. Not the knowledge that comes from idealization, which is not knowledge but projection, and not the knowledge that comes from suspicion, which is not knowledge but defense, but the actual knowledge of a specific flawed human being who had done specific things for specific reasons and was continuing to do them. Dominic DeLuca had built a life around the structures of organized power, had made choices she did not approve of and would not pretend to, and had never asked her to pretend to. He had come off a wire in a hurricane for reasons that included a debt that was 30 years old and something more immediate that he had named in a car at 5 in the morning with the flatness of a man saying the true thing in the simplest way because simplicity was the only honest option. He had kept her alive and had not managed her, and had shown her the documents and had been honest about the costs, and had stood at thresholds and waited to be invited in. She was not naive about what that meant. She was not a woman who confused the absence of sentimentality for depth, or who mistook danger for character. She had spent 9 days watching what he actually did. Not the reputation, not the name, but the specific actions of a specific man under specific pressure. And what he actually did was what she had seen. She had decided that what she had seen was enough to look at further. The DeLuca Foundation was announced on a Thursday, 6 weeks after Hurricane Iris made landfall. The announcement was not made by Dominic. It was made by a woman named Patricia Osei, the foundation's executive director, at a press conference in Savannah that Evelyn attended as a private citizen, and not in any official capacity. The foundation had been established with the recovered relief funds, $42 million, the final audited figure, returned to the channel it had been diverted from, and its stated purpose was the rebuilding of hurricane-damaged homes for families who could not afford contractors and whose insurance claims had been delayed or denied in the chaos following Iris. Evelyn stood at the back of the room during the announcement and watched Patricia Osei speak about the scope of the work ahead, the neighborhoods, the timelines, the hiring protocols that would prioritize local workers who had themselves been displaced. And she thought about the house on Magnolia Creek Drive, which had taken 4 feet of water on the ground floor and was currently gutted to the studs waiting for someone to decide what to do with it. She thought about the other houses on that street and the streets adjacent to it, about the Grierson hardware building where she had spent the worst hours of her life on a rooftop with the rain coming down and no signal on her phone, about a city that had been building itself back up street by street for 6 weeks with the specific, exhausted determination of people who have nowhere else to go and therefore have no option except forward. Dominic was not at the press conference. He had told her, the night before, that he would not be there. "It's better without me in it," he said. "The foundation works better if it isn't associated with the name." He said it without self-pity, which was the only way he said anything, and she understood it was true, and she also understood that the truth of it was something he had long since made a private peace with. The specific peace of a man who has accepted that some of what he wants to be responsible for, he cannot be seen to be responsible for, that the useful version of himself is sometimes the invisible one. She had looked at him when he said it and thought about what that cost, and thought that she was beginning to understand the full inventory of what it cost, and that the understanding of it was the thing she had been building toward across these weeks without naming it. After the press conference, she drove back to the house and found him in the kitchen. He was there in the mornings, most mornings now, with the coffee and the window, and she came in and put her bag on the chair and stood across the room from him. He looked at her. She said, "It was good. Patricia is—" "I know," he said. "She'll be good at it." The neighborhood associations turned out more than they expected. Good. She looked at him. He looked at her. The kitchen was morning quiet. Hope somewhere upstairs with Carver, who had stayed on in a capacity that had evolved organically from medical necessity into something more permanent and entirely unspoken, in the way that some things become permanent. "I found a house," she said. He was very still. "It's in Ardsley Park," she said. 2 blocks from where I used to work. It needs some work. The storm took the back porch and the fence, but the structure's sound. I had an engineer look at it." She paused. "I can close next month if the loan comes through. I think it will." "Evelyn," he said. "I'm not leaving Savannah," she said. "That's what I'm telling you. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to go back to work at the hospital when Hope is old enough, and I'm going to buy a house 2 blocks from where I spent 11 years, and I'm going to rebuild what got washed out." She looked at him steadily. "I'm telling you that because I thought you should know where I am. Going to be." He looked at her for a long time. "And Hope," he said. "Hope is going to grow up in Savannah," she said, "with whatever that means, whoever that includes." The whatever and the whoever sat in the air between them. Not ambiguous exactly, but open, deliberately open, the way you leave a door open when you want someone to know they can walk through it and want the walking through it to be their choice. He set down his coffee cup. He crossed the kitchen in the way he moved, without excess, without performance, the specific economy of a man who has learned that most gestures only need to happen once. And he stopped in front of her and looked at her with the dark eyes that she had 9 weeks of vocabulary for now, that she could read with reasonable accuracy, that were doing right now the thing she had seen them do in the car at 5 in the morning when he said that was something else. He said, "I'll come by on Saturdays to help with the house." She looked at him. "Just Saturdays." "To start," he said. She almost smiled. It got most of the way there. "To start," she said. Mustang. The first Saturday he came in the morning and they worked until the afternoon, stripping the damaged porch boards while Hope slept in a carrier strapped to Evelyn's chest. And he worked with the same efficiency he brought to everything. Focused, specific, no wasted motion. And they talked, intermittently, the way people talk when they are doing physical work together, which is differently than any other kind of talking, with longer pauses and more honesty in the pauses than in the words. He told her about his father. Not all of it. There was a lot she understood she would learn in increments over time, because that was the only way certain things could be told. But pieces of it, specific pieces, the texture of a childhood that had been inside something she would not have chosen and had produced somehow the man standing on her porch, pulling nails from waterlogged wood. She told him about her mother, about the small house in Beaufort and the nurse's income, and the philosophy that was never spoken but was everywhere in that house, about the pale green eyes, about the last thing she'd said. He listened the way he did everything, completely, without the half-listening of a person assembling their response while you speak, but with the full attention of someone who understands that listening is an act and chooses to perform it correctly. When she said the good ones always find each other, he looked at her without speaking, and the look had in it the recognition of a man hearing a sentence that was also about him, that had been about him for 30 years before either of them existed in this form. He went back to pulling nails. After a while he said, "She was right." "Yes," Evelyn said. She was. Hope made a small sound against her chest. Not waking, not distress, just the involuntary small sound of a person who is alive and dreaming and moving through the world on her own interior timeline. And Evelyn put her right hand against the carrier and felt the warmth of her daughter against her palm and looked out at the street, at Ardsley Park in the October light that was finally, for the first time since August, doing what October was supposed to do. Cool, gold, the quality of light that has given up the summer's aggression and arrived at something quieter and more sustainable. The porch was going to take another 2 Saturdays, at minimum. She thought that was probably all right. She thought that 2 Saturdays, and then the next 2, and then the ones after that, were a reasonable unit of measurement for what she was building. Not fast, not certain, not the kind of thing you could authorize and route and timestamp and deliver as a completed package by morning. The slow kind. The kind that was built board by board in the specific company of specific people, with the noise of a city repairing itself all around you, and a baby asleep against your chest and the October light falling on everything equally, on the boards and the nails and the water stains from a storm that had come through and taken things and left other things behind. Some storms, she thought, destroy. Some reveal. She picked up the next board,